This is Stirring Times in Austria, Part 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg and Other Stories by Mark Twain. Section 28. Stirring Times in Austria, Part 3. Curious Parliamentary Etiquette. In consequence of Dr. Lesher's 12-hour speech and the other obstructions furnished by the minority, the famous 33-hour sitting of the House accomplished nothing. The government side had made a supreme effort, assisting itself with all the helps at hand, both lawful and unlawful, yet had failed to get the Ausgleich into the hands of a committee. This was a severe defeat. The right was mortified, the left jubilant. Parliament was adjourned for a week, to let the members cool off, perhaps, a sacrifice of precious time, for but 2 months remained in which to carry the all-important Ausgleich to a consummation. If I have reported the behavior of the House intelligibly, the reader has been surprised by it, and has wondered whence these lawmakers come, and what they are made of, and he has probably supposed that the conduct exhibited at the long sitting was far out of the common, and due to special excitement and irritation. As to the make-up of the House, it is this: the deputies come from all the walks of life and from all the grades of society. There are princes, counts, barons, priests, peasants, mechanics, laborers, lawyers, judges, physicians, professors, merchants, bankers, shopkeepers. They are religious men, they are earnest, sincere, devoted, and they hate the Jews. The title of doctor is so common in the House that one may almost say that the deputy who does not bear it is by that reason conspicuous. I am assured that it is not a self-granted title, and not an honorary one, but an earned one; that in Austria it is very seldom conferred as a mere compliment; that in Austria the degrees of Doctor of Music, Doctor of Philosophy, and so on, are not conferred by the seats of learning; and so, when an Austrian is called Doctor, it means that he is either a lawyer or a physician, and that he is not a self-educated man, but is college-bred, and has been diplomaed for merit. That answers the question of the constitution of the House. Now as to the House's curious manners. The manners exhibited by this convention of doctors were not at that time being tried as a wholly new experiment. I will go back to a previous sitting in order to show that the deputies had already had some practice. There had been an incident. The dignity of the House had been wounded by improprieties indulged in its presence, by a couple of the members. This matter was placed in the hands of a committee to determine where the guilt lay and the degree of it, and also to suggest the punishment. The chairman of the committee brought in his report. By this it appeared that in the course of a speech Deputy Schrammel said that religion had no proper place in the public schools. It was a private matter, whereupon Deputy Gregorig shouted, "How about free love?" To this Deputy Iro flung out this retort, "Soda water at the Wimberger." This appeared to deeply offend Deputy Gregorig, who shouted back at Iro, "You cowardly blatherskite! Say that again!" The committee had sat 3 hours. Gregorig had apologized. Iro explained that he didn't say anything about soda water at the Wimberger. He explained in writing, and was very explicit. "I declare upon my word of honor that I did not say the words attributed to me." Unhappily for his word of honor, it was proved by the official stenographers and by the testimony of several deputies that he did say them. The committee did not officially know why the apparently inconsequential reference to soda water at the Wimberger should move Deputy Gregorig to call the utterer of it a cowardly blatherskite. Still, after proper deliberation, it was of the opinion that the House ought to formally censure the whole business. This verdict seems to have been regarded as sharply severe. I think so because Deputy Dr. Luger, Burgermeister of Vienna, felt it a duty to soften the blow to his friend Gregorig by showing that the soda-water remark was not so innocuous as it might look, that indeed Gregorig's tough raillery was justifiable, and he proceeded to explain why. He read a number of scandalous postcards, which he intimated had proceeded from Iro, as indicated by the handwriting, though they were anonymous. Some of them were posted to Gregorig at his place of business, and could have been read by all his subordinates. The others were posted to Gregorig's wife. Luger did not say, but everybody knew, that the cards referred to a matter of town gossip which made Mr. Gregorig a chief actor in a tavern scene where siphon squirting played a prominent and humorous part, and wherein women had a share. There were several of the cards, more than several, in fact. No fewer than 5 were sent in one day. Dr. Luger read some of them and described others. Some of them had pictures on them. One, a picture of a hog with a monstrous snout, and beside it a squirting soda siphon. Below it some sarcastic doggerel. Gregorig dealt in shirts, cravats, etc. One of the cards bore these words, "Much respected deputy and collar sewer or stealer." Another, "Hurrah for the Christian social work among the women assemblages. Hurrah for the soda squirter." Comment by Dr. Luger, "I cannot venture to read the rest of that one, nor the signature either." Another, "Would you mind telling me if—" Comment by Dr. Luger, "The rest of it is not properly readable." To Deputy Gregorig's wife, "Much respected Madame Gregorig, the undersigned desires an invitation to the next soda squirt." Comment by Dr. Luger, "Neither the rest of the card nor the signature can I venture to read to the house, so vulgar are they." The purpose of this card, to expose Gregorig to his family, was repeated in others of these anonymous missives. The House, by vote, censured the 2 improper deputies. This may have had a modifying effect upon the phraseology of the membership for a while, and upon its general exuberance also, but it was not for long. As has been seen, it had become lively once more on the night of the long sitting. At the next sitting after the long one, there was certainly no lack of liveliness. The President was persistently ignoring the rules of the House in the interest of the government side, and the minority were in an unappeasable fury about it. The ceaseless din and uproar, the shouting and stamping and desk-banging, were deafening, but through it all burst voices now and then that made themselves heard. Some of the remarks were of a very candid sort, and I believe that if they had been uttered in our House of Representatives, they would have attracted attention. I will insert some samples here, not in their order, but selected on their merits. Mr. Meyerder to the President, "You have lied. You conceded the floor to me. Make it good, or you have lied." Mr. Glockner to the President, "Leave. Get out." Wolf, indicating the President, "There sits a man to whom a certain title belongs." Unto Wolf, who is continuously reading in a powerful voice from a newspaper, arrive these personal remarks from the majority. "Oh, shut your mouth!" "Put him out!" "Out with him!" Wolf stops reading a moment to shout at Dr. Luger, who has the floor, but cannot get her hearing. "Please, betrayer of the people, begin." Dr. Luger, "Mein Herren!" "Oh-ho!" and groans. Wolf, "That's the holy light of the Christian Socialists." Mr. Glexenbauer, Christian Socialist, "Damnation! Are you ever going to quiet down?" Wolf discharges a galling remark at Mr. Wohlmeyer. Wohlmeyer responding, "You Jew, you!" There's a moment's lull, and Dr. Luger begins his speech. Graceful, handsome man, with winning manners and attractive bearing, a bright and easy speaker, and is said to know how to trim his political sails to catch any favoring wind that blows. He manages to say a few words, then the tempest overwhelms him again. Wolf stops reading his paper a moment to say a drastic thing about Luger and his Christian social pieties, which sets the C.S.S. in a sort of frenzy. Mr. Vielalowek, "You leave the Christian Socialists alone, you word of honor breaker. Obstruct all you want to, but you leave them alone. You've no business in this house. You belong in a gin mill." Mr. Prochaska, "In a lunatic asylum, you mean." Vielalowek, "It's a pity that such a man should be leader of the Germans. He disgraces the German name." Dr. Scheicher, "It's a shame that the like of him should insult us." Strobach, to Wolf, "Contemptible cub, we will bounce thee out of this." It is inferable that the "thee" is not intended to indicate affection this time, but to reinforce and emphasize Mr. Starbach's scorn. Dr. Scheicher: His insults are of no consequence. He wants his ears boxed. Dr. Luger (to Wolf): You'd better worry a trifle over your hero's word of honor. You are behaving like a street Arab. Dr. Scheicher: It is infamous. Dr. Luger: And these shameless creatures are the leaders of the German People's Party. Meantime Wolf goes whooping along with his newspaper reading in great contentment. Dr. Pattei: Shut up! Shut up! Shut up! You haven't the floor! Strobach: The miserable cub! Dr. Luger (to Wolf, raising his voice strenuously above the storm): You are a wholly honorless street brat! A voice: Fire the rapscallion out! But Wolf's soul goes marching noisily on, just the same. Schonerer, vast and muscular, and endowed with the most powerful voice in the Reichsrath, comes plowing down through the standing crowds, red and choking with anger, halts before Deputy Wohlmeyer, grabs a rule and smashes it with a blow upon a desk, threatens Wohlmeyer's face with his fist, and bellows out some personalities and a promise: Only you wait, we'll teach you. A whirlwind of offensive retorts assails him from the band of meek and humble Christian Socialists compacted around their leader, that distinguished religious expert Dr. Luger, Burgermeister of Vienna. Our breath comes in excited gasps now, and we are full of hope. We imagine that we are back 50 years ago in the Arkansas legislature, and we think we know what is going to happen, and are glad we came, and glad we are up in the gallery out of the way, where we can see the whole thing and yet not have to supply any of the material for the inquest. However, as it turns out, our confidence is abused, our hopes are misplaced. Dr. Pattei, wildly excited: You quiet down, or we shall turn ourselves loose. There will be cuffing of ears. Prochaska (in a fury): No, not ear-boxing, but genuine blows. Vieholowek: I would rather take my hat off to a Jew than to Wolf. Strobach (to Wolf): Jew flunkey, here we have been fighting the Jews for 10 years, and now you are helping them to power again. How much do you get for it? Holansky: What he wants is a strait-jacket. Wolf continues his reading. It is a market report now. Remark flung across the house to Schonerer: Die Großmutter auf dem Misthaufen ist erworden. It will be judicious not to translate that. Its flavor is pretty high in any case, but it becomes particularly gamey when you remember that the first gallery was well stocked with ladies. Apparently it was a great hit. It fetched thunders of joyous enthusiasm out of the Christian Socialists, and in their rapture they flung biting epithets with wasteful liberality at specially detested members of the opposition. Among others, this one at Schonerer: Bordel in der Krugerstrasse. Then they added these words, which they whooped, howled, and also even sang, in a deep-voiced chorus: Schmül lieb Köln! Schmül lieb Köln! Schmül lieb Köln! And made it splendidly audible above the banging of desk-boards and the rest of the roaring cyclone of fiendish noises. A gallery witticism comes flitting by from mouth to mouth around the great curve, the swan song of Austrian representative government. You can note its progress by the applausive smiles and nods it gets as it skims along. Kletzenbauer: Holofernes, where is Judith? Storm of laughter. Gregorig, the shirt merchant: This Wolf Theatre is costing 6,000 florins. Wolf, with sweetness: Notice him, gentlemen. It is Mr. Gregorig. Laughter. Vieholowek (to Wolf): You Judas! Schneider: Brothel knight! Chorus of voices: East German offal tub! And so the war of epithets crashes along with never diminishing energy for a couple of hours. The ladies in the gallery were learning. That was well, for by and by ladies will form a part of the membership of all the legislatures in the world. As soon as they can prove competency, they will be admitted. At present, men only are competent to legislate. Therefore they look down upon women, and would feel degraded if they had to have them for colleagues in their high calling. Wolf is yelling another market report now. Gessman: Shut up, infamous louse brat! During a momentary lull, Dr. Luger gets a hearing for 3 sentences of his speech. They demand and require that the President shall suppress the 4 noisiest members of the opposition. Wolf, with a "that settles it" toss of the head, "The shifty trickster of Vienna has spoken." Iro belonged to Schonerer's party. The word of honor incident has given it a new name. Grigorig is a Christian socialist, and hero of the postcards and the Wimberger soda-squirting incident. He stands vast and conspicuous, and conceited and self-satisfied, and roosterish, and inconsequential, at Luger's elbow, and is proud and cocky to be in such a great company. He looks very well indeed, really majestic, and aware of it. He crows out his little empty remark now and then, and looks as pleased as if he had been delivered of the Ausgleich. Indeed, he does look notably fine. He wears almost the only dress vest on the floor. It exposes a continental spread of white shirt-front. His hands are posed at ease in the lips of his trouser pockets. His head is tilted back complacently. He is attitudinizing. He is playing to the gallery. However, they are all doing that. It is curious to see men who only vote, and can't make speeches, and don't know how to invent witty ejaculations, wander about the vacated parts of the floor, and stop in a good place and strike attitudes suggestive of weighty thought, mostly, and glance furtively up at the galleries to see how it works. Or a couple will come together and shake hands in an artificial way, and laugh a gay manufactured laugh, and do some constrained and self-conscious attitudinizing, and they steal glances at the galleries to see if they are getting notice. It is like a scene on the stage, byplay by minor actors at the back, while the stars do the great work at the front. Even Count Badeni attitudinizes for a moment, strikes a reflective Napoleonic attitude of fine picturesqueness, but soon thinks better of it and desists. There are 2 who do not attitudinize. Poor harried and insulted President Abrahamowitz, who seems wholly miserable, and can find no way to put in the dreary time but by swinging his bell and discharging occasional remarks which nobody can hear, and a resigned and patient priest who sits lonely in a great vacancy on majority territory and munches an apple. Schonerer uplifts his foghorn of a voice and shakes the roof with an insult discharged at the majority. Dr. Luger: "The honorless party would better keep still here." Grigorig, the echo, swelling out his shirt-front: "Yes, keep quiet, pimp." Schonerer to Luger: "Political mountebank." Prochaska to Schonerer: "Drunken clown." During the final hour of the sitting, many happy phrases were distributed through the proceedings. Among them were these, and they are strikingly good ones: blatherskite, blackguard, scoundrel, brothel daddy. This last was the contribution of Dr. Gesman, and gave great satisfaction, and deservedly. It seems to me that it was one of the most sparkling things that was said during the whole evening. At 2:30 in the morning the House adjourned. The victory was with the opposition. No, not quite that. The effective part of it was snatched away from them by an unlawful exercise of presidential force, another contribution toward driving the mistreated minority out of their minds. At other sittings of the Parliament, gentlemen of the opposition, shaking their fists toward the President, addressed him as "Polish dog." At one sitting an angry deputy turned upon a colleague and shouted blank. You must try to imagine what it was. If I should offer it even in the original, it would probably not get by the editor's blue pencil. To offer a translation would be to waste my ink, of course. This remark was frankly printed in its entirety by one of the Vienna dailies, but the others disguised the toughest half of it with stars. If the reader will go back over this chapter and gather its array of extraordinary epithets into a bunch and examine them, he will marvel at 2 things: how this convention of gentlemen could consent to use such gross terms, and why the users were allowed to get out of the place alive. There is no way to understand this strange situation. If every man in the house were a professional blackguard and had his home in a sailor boarding-house, one could still not understand it. For although that sort do use such terms, they never take them. These men are not professional blackguards. They are mainly gentlemen, and educated. Yet they use the terms, and take them, too. They really seem to attach no consequence to them. One cannot say that they act like schoolboys, for that is only almost true, not entirely. Schoolboys blackguard each other fiercely, and by the hour, and one would think that nothing would ever come of it but noise. But that would be a mistake. Up to a certain limit the result would be noise only, but, that limit overstepped, trouble would follow right away. There are certain phrases of a peculiar character, phrases of the nature of that reference to Schonerer's grandmother, for instance, which not even the most spiritless schoolboy in the English-speaking world would allow to pass unavenged. One difference between schoolboys and the lawmakers of the Reichsrath seems to be that the lawmakers have no limit, no danger line. Apparently they may call each other what they please and go home unmutilated. Now, in fact, they did have a scuffle on 2 occasions, but it was not on account of names called. There has been no scuffle where that was the cause. It is not to be inferred that the House lacks a sense of honor because it lacks delicacy. That would be an error. Iro was caught in a lie, and it profoundly disgraced him. The House cut him, turned its back upon him. He resigned his seat. Otherwise he would have been expelled. But it was lenient with Gregorig, who had called Iro a cowardly blatherskipe in debate. It merely went through the form of mildly censuring him. That did not trouble Gregorig. The Viennese say of themselves that they are an easy-going, pleasure-loving community, making the best of life, and not taking it very seriously. Nevertheless, they are grieved about the ways of their Parliament, and say quite frankly that they are ashamed. They claim that the low condition of the Parliament's manners is new, not old. A gentleman who was at the head of the government 20 years ago confirms this, and says that in his time the Parliament was orderly and well behaved. An English gentleman of long residence here endorses this, and says that a low order of politicians originated the present forms of questionable speech on the stump some years ago, and imported them into the Parliament. Note 2. In that gracious bygone time when a mild and good-tempered spirit was the atmosphere of our House, when the manner of our speakers was studiously formal and academic, and the storms and explosions of today were wholly unknown, etc., etc. Translation of the opening remark of a leading article in this morning's Neue Freie Presse, December 11th. End of note 2. However, some day there will be a minister of etiquette and a sergeant-at-arms, and then things will go better. I mean if Parliament and the Constitution survive the present storm. End of Part 3 of Stirring Times in Austria, and end of Section 28 of The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg and Other Stories by Mark Twain. This is Part 4 of Stirring Times in Austria. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg and Other Stories by Mark Twain. Segment 29. Stirring Times in Austria, Part 4. The Historic Climax. During the whole of November, things went from bad to worse. The all-important Ausgleich remained hard aground and could not be sparred off. Badeni's government could not withdraw the language ordinance and keep its majority, and the opposition could not be placated on easier terms. On one night, while the customary pandemonium was crashing and thundering along at its best, a fight broke out. It was a surging, struggling, shoulder-to-shoulder scramble. A great many blows were struck. Twice Schonerer lifted one of the heavy ministerial fauteuils, some say with one hand, and threatened members of the majority with it, but it was wrenched away from him. A member hammered Wolf over the head with the president's bell, and another member choked him. A professor was flung down and belabored with fists and choked. He held up an open penknife as a defense against the blows. It was snatched from him and flung to a distance. It hit a peaceful Christian socialist who wasn't doing anything, and brought blood from his hand. This was the only blood drawn. The men who got hammered and choked looked sound and well next day. The fists and the bell were not properly handled, or better results would have been apparent. I am quite sure that the fighters were not in earnest. On Thanksgiving Day the sitting was a history-making one. On that day the harried, bedeviled, and despairing government went insane. In order to free itself from the thraldom of the opposition, it committed this curiously juvenile crime. It moved an important change of the rules of the House, forbade debate upon the motion, put it on a stand-up vote instead of ayes and noes, and then gravely claimed that it had been adopted, whereas, to even the dullest witness, if I without immodesty may pretend to that place, it was plain that nothing legitimately to be called a vote had been taken at all. I think that Saltpeter never uttered a truer thing than when he said, "Whom the gods would destroy they first make mad." Evidently the government's mind was tottering when this bald insult to the House was the best way it could contrive for getting out of the frying-pan. The episode would have been funny if the matter at stake had been a trifle, but in the circumstances it was pathetic. The usual storm was raging in the House. As usual, many of the majority and most of the minority were standing up to have a better chance to exchange epithets and make other noises. Into this storm Count Falkenhayn entered, with his paper in his hand, and at once there was a rush to get near him and hear him read his motion. In a moment he was walled in by listeners. The several clauses of his motion were loudly applauded by these allies, and as loudly disapplauded, if I may invent a word, by such of the opposition as could hear his voice. When he took his seat, the President promptly put the motion: persons desiring to vote in the affirmative, stand up. The House was already standing up, had been standing for an hour, and before a third of it had found out what the President had been saying, he had proclaimed the adoption of the motion. And only a few heard that. In fact, when that House is legislating, you can't tell it from artillery practice. You will realize what a happy idea it was to sidetrack the lawful ayes and noes and substitute a stand-up vote by this fact, that a little later, when a deputation of deputies waited upon the President and asked him if he was actually willing to claim that that measure had been passed, he answered, "Yes, and unanimously." It shows that in effect the whole House was on its feet when that trick was sprung. The Lex Falkenhayn, thus strangely born, gave the President power to suspend for 3 days any deputy who should continue to be disorderly after being called to order twice, and it also placed at his disposal such force as might be necessary to make the suspension effective. So the House had a sergeant-at-arms at last, and a more formidable one as to power than any other legislature in Christendom had ever possessed. The Lex Falkenhayn also gave the House itself authority to suspend members for 30 days. On these terms the Ausgleich could be put through in an hour, apparently. The opposition would have to sit meek and quiet and stop obstructing, or be turned into the street, deputy after deputy, leaving the majority an unvexed field for its work. Certainly the thing looked well. The government was out of the frying-pan at last. It congratulated itself, and was almost girlishly happy. Its stock rose suddenly from less than nothing to a premium. It confessed to itself, with pride, that its Lex Falkenhayn was a masterstroke, a work of genius. However, there were doubters, men who were troubled and believed that a grave mistake had been made. It might be that the opposition was crushed, and profitably for the country, too. But the manner of it, that was the serious part. It could have far-reaching results whose gravity might transcend all guessing. It might be the initial step toward a return to government by force, a restoration of the irresponsible methods of obsolete times. There were no vacant seats in the galleries next day. In fact, standing room outside the building was at a premium. There were crowds there, and a glittering array of helmeted and brass-buttoned police, on foot and on horseback, to keep them from getting too much excited. No one could guess what was going to happen, but everyone felt that something was going to happen, and hoped he might have a chance to see it, or at least get the news of it while it was fresh. At noon the House was empty, for I do not count myself. Half an hour later the two galleries were solidly packed, the floor still empty. Another half-hour later Wolfe entered and passed to his place. Then other deputies began to stream in. among them many forms and faces grown familiar of late. By 1 o'clock the membership was present in full force. A band of Socialists stood grouped against the ministerial desks in the shadow of the presidential tribune. It was observable that these official strongholds were now protected against rushes by bolted gates, and that these were in ward of servants wearing the House's livery. Also, the removable desk boards had been taken away, and nothing left for disorderly members to slat with. There was a pervading anxious hush, at least what stood very well for a hush in that House. It was believed by many that the opposition was cowed, and that there would be no more obstruction, no more noise. That was an error. Presently the President entered by the distant door to the right, followed by Vice President Fuchs, and the two took their way down past the Polish benches toward the tribune. Instantly the customary storm of noises burst out, and rose higher and higher, and wilder, and really seemed to surpass anything that had gone before it in that place. The President took his seat and begged for order, but no one could hear him. His lips moved, one could see that. He bowed his head forward appealingly, and spread his great hand eloquently over his breast, one could see that. But as concerned his uttered words, he probably could not hear them himself. Below him was that crowd of 24 Socialists glaring up at him, shaking their fists at him, roaring imprecations and insulting epithets at him. This went on for some time. Suddenly the Socialists burst through the gates and stormed up through the ministerial benches, and a man in a red cravat reached up and snatched the documents that lay on the President's desk and flung them abroad. The next moment he and his allies were struggling and fighting with the half-dozen uniformed servants who were there to protect the new gates. Meantime a detail of Socialists had swarmed up the side steps and overflowed the President and the Vice, and were crowding and shouldering and shoving them out of the place. They crowded them out, and down the steps, and across the House, past the Polish benches, and all about them swarmed hostile Poles and Czechs, who resisted them. One could see fists go up and come down, with other signs and shows of a heady fight. Then the President and the Vice disappeared through the door of entrance, and the victorious Socialists turned and marched back, mounted the tribune, flung the President's bell and his remaining papers abroad, and then stood there in a compact little crowd, 11 strong, and held the place as if it were a fortress. Their friends on the floor were in a frenzy of triumph, and manifested it in their deafening way. The whole House was on its feet, amazed and wondering. It was an astonishing situation, and imposingly dramatic. Nobody had looked for this. The unexpected had happened. What next? But there can be no next. The play is over. The grand climax is reached. The possibilities are exhausted. Ring down the curtain. Not yet. That distant door opens again, and now we see what history will be talking of 5 centuries hence. A uniformed and helmeted battalion of bronzed and stalwart men marching in double file down the floor of the House, a free Parliament profaned by an invasion of brute force. It was an odious spectacle, odious and awful. For one moment it was an unbelievable thing, a thing beyond all credibility. It must be a delusion, a dream, a nightmare. But no, it was real, pitifully real, shamefully real, hideously real. These 60 policemen had been soldiers, and they went at their work with the cold unsentimentality of their trade. They ascended the steps of the tribune, laid their hands upon the inviolable persons of the representatives of the nation, and dragged and tugged and hauled them down the steps and out at the door, then ranged themselves in stately military array in front of the ministerial estrade, and so stood. It was a tremendous episode. The memory of it will outlast all the thrones that exist today. In the whole history of free parliaments the like of it had been seen but 3 times before. It takes its imposing place among the world's unforgettable things. I think that in my lifetime I have not twice seen abiding history made before my eyes, but I know that I have seen it once. Some of the results of this wild freak followed instantly. The Badeni government came down with a crash. There was a popular outbreak or two in Vienna. There were 3 or 4 days of furious rioting in Prague, followed by the establishing there of martial law. The Jews and Germans were harried and plundered, and their houses destroyed. In other Bohemian towns there was rioting. in some cases the Germans being the rioters, in others the Czechs, and in all cases the Jew had to roast, no matter which side he was on. We are well along in December now. Note 3. It is the 9th, M.T. The next new minister-president has not been able to patch up a peace among the warring factions of the Parliament. Therefore, there is no use in calling it together again for the present. Public opinion believes that parliamentary government and the Constitution are actually threatened with extinction, and that the permanency of the monarchy itself is a not absolutely certain thing. Yes, the Lex Falkenhayn was a great invention, and did what was claimed for it. It got the government out of the frying pan. End of Part 4 of Stirring Times in Austria, and end of Segment 29 of The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg and Other Stories by Mark Twain. This is the private history of the Jumping Frog story. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg and Other Stories by Mark Twain. Section 30. Private History of the Jumping Frog Story. 5 or 6 years ago, a lady from Finland asked me to tell her a story in our Negro dialect so that she could get an idea of what that variety of speech was like. I told her one of Hopkinson Smith's Negro stories and gave her a copy of Harper's Monthly containing it. She translated it for a Swedish newspaper, but by an oversight named me as the author of it instead of Smith. I was very sorry for that, because I got a good lashing in the Swedish press, which would have fallen to his share but for that mistake, for it was shown that Boccaccio had told that very story in his curt and meagre fashion 500 years before Smith took hold of it and made a good and tellable thing out of it. I have always been sorry for Smith, but my own turn has come now. A few weeks ago Professor Van Dyke of Princeton asked this question: "Do you know how old your Jumping Frog story is?" And I answered, "Yes, 45 years. The thing happened in Calaveras County in the spring of 1849. No, it happened earlier, a couple of 1,000 years earlier. It is a Greek story." I was astonished and hurt. I said, "I am willing to be a literary thief, if it has been so ordained. I am even willing to be caught robbing the ancient dead alongside of Hopkinson Smith, for he is my friend and a good fellow, and I think would be as honest as anyone if he could do it without occasioning remark. But I am not willing to antedate his crimes by 1,500 years. I must ask you to knock off part of that." But the professor was not chaffing. He was in earnest, and could not abate a century. He offered to get the book and send it to me, and the Cambridge textbook containing the English translation also. I thought I would like the translation best, because Greek makes me tired. January 30th he sent me the English version, and I will presently insert it in this article. It is my Jumping Frog tale in every essential. It is not strung out as I have strung it out, but it is all there. To me this is very curious and interesting. Curious for several reasons. For instance, I heard the story told by a man who was not telling it to his hearers as a thing new to them, but as a thing which they had witnessed and would remember. He was a dull person and ignorant. He had no gift as a storyteller and no invention. In his mouth this episode was merely history and statistics, and the gravest sort of history, too. He was entirely serious, for he was dealing with what to him were austere facts, and they interested him solely because they were facts. He was drawing on his memory, not his mind. He saw no humor in his tale, neither did his listeners. Neither he nor they ever smiled or laughed. In my time I have not attended a more solemn conference. To him and to his fellow gold miners there were just two things in the story that were worth considering. One was the smartness of its hero, Jim Smiley, in taking the stranger in with a loaded frog, and the other was Smiley's deep knowledge of a frog's nature, for he knew, as the narrator asserted and the listeners conceded, that a frog likes shot and is already ready to eat it. Those men discussed those 2 points, and those only. They were hearty in their admiration of them, and none of the party was aware that a first-rate story had been told in a first-rate way, and that it was brimful of a quality whose presence they never suspected humor. Now then, the interesting question is, did the frog episode happen in Angel's camp in the spring of '49, as told in my hearing that day in the fall of 1865? I am perfectly sure that it did. I am also sure that its duplicate happened in Boyhood a couple of thousand years ago. I think it must be a case of history actually repeating itself, and not a case of a good story floating down the ages and surviving because too good to be allowed to perish. I would now like to have the reader examine the Greek story and the story told by the dull and solemn Californian, and observe how exactly alike they are in essentials. Translation: The Athenian and the Frog. Note 1. Sidgwick, Green Prose Composition, page 116. An Athenian once fell in with a Boeotian who was sitting by the roadside looking at a frog. Seeing the other approach, the Boeotian said his was a remarkable frog, and asked if he would agree to start a contest of frogs on condition that he whose frogs jumped farthest should receive a large sum of money. The Athenian replied that he would, if the other would fetch him a frog, for the lake was near. To this he agreed, and when he was gone the Athenian took the frog, and, opening its mouth, poured some stones into its stomach, so that it did not indeed seem larger than before, but could not jump. The Boeotian soon returned with the other frog, and the contest began. The second frog first was pinched and jumped moderately. Then they pinched the Boeotian frog, and he gathered himself for a leap and used the utmost effort, but he could not move his body the least. So the Athenian departed with the money. When he was gone, the Boeotian, wondering what was the matter with the frog, lifted him up and examined him, and, being turned upside down, he opened his mouth and vomited out the stones. And here is the way it happened in California. From the celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. Well, this here Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and tomcats and all them kind of things, till you couldn't rest, and you couldn't fetch nothing for him to bet on, but he'd match you. He ketched a frog one day and took him home, and said he calculated to educate him. And so he never done nothing for 3 months but set in his backyard and learned that frog to jump. And you bet you he did learn him, too. He'd given him a little punch behind, and the next minute you'd seen that frog whirling in the air like a doughnut. See him turn one somerset? More maybe a couple if he got a good start, and come down flat-footed and all right like a cat. He got him up so in the manner of catching flies, and kept him in practice so constant that he'd nail a fly every time as fur as he could see him. Smiley said all a frog wanted was education, and he could do most anything, and I believe him. Why, I've seen him set Daniel Webster down here on this floor. Daniel Webster was the name of the frog, and sing out, "Flies, Daniel, flies!" And quicker'n you could wink he'd spring straight up and snake a fly off on the counter there, and flop down on the floor again as solid as a gob of mud, and fall to scratching the side of his head with his hind foot as indifferent as if he hadn't no idea he'd been doing any more than any frog might do. You never see a frog so modest and straightforward as he was, for all he was so gifted, and when it come to fire and squire jumping on a dead level, he could get over more ground at one straddle than any animal of his breed you ever see. Jumping on a dead level was his strong suit, you understand, and when it came to that, Smiley would ante up money on him as long as he had a red. Smiley was monstrous proud of his frog, and well he might be, for fellers that had traveled and been everywheres all said he laid over any frog that ever they see. Well, Smiley kept the beast in a little lattice box, and he used to fetch him downtown sometimes and lay for a bet. One day a feller, a stranger in the camp he was, come crossed him with his box and says, "What might it be that you've got in the box?" And Smiley says, sorter indifferent like, "It might be a parrot,
or it might be a canary maybe, but it ain't. It's only just a frog." And the feller took it and looked at it careful, and turned it round this way and that, and says, so 'tis. Well, what's it good for?" "Well," Smiley says, easy and careless, "he's good enough for one thing, I should judge. He can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." The feller took the box again, and took another long, particular look, and give it back to Smiley, and says, very deliberate, "Well," he says, "I don't see no p'ints about that frog that's any better'n any other frog." "Maybe you don't," Smiley says. "Maybe you understand frogs, and maybe you don't understand 'em. Maybe you've had experience, and maybe you ain't only a amateur, as it were. Anyways, I got my opinion, and I'll resk $40 that he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." And the feller studies a minute, and then he says, kinder sad like, "Well, I'm only a stranger here, and I ain't got no frog, but if I had a frog I'd bet you." And then Smiley says, "That's all right, that's all right. If you'll hold my box a minute, I'll go and get you a frog." So the feller took the box, and put up his $40 along with Smiley's, and set down to wait. So he set there a good while, thinking and thinking to himself, and then he got the frog out and prized his mouth open, and took a teaspoon and filled him full of quail shot, filled him pretty near up to his chin, and set him on the floor. Smiley he went to the swamp and slopped around in the mud for a long time, and finally he ketched a frog and fetched him in, and give him to this feller, and says, "Now, if you're ready, set him alongside of Daniel, with his forepaws just even with Daniel's, and I'll give the word." Then he says, "1, 2, 3, git!" And him and the feller touched up the frogs from behind, and the new frog hopped off lively, but Dan'l gave a heave, and histed up his shoulders, so, like a Frenchman, but it warn't no use. He couldn't budge. He was planted as solid as a church, and he couldn't do no more stir than if he was anchored out. Smiley was a good deal surprised, and he was disgusted, too, but he didn't have no idea what the matter was, of course. The feller took the money and started away, and when he was going out at the door he sorter jerked his thumb over his shoulder, so, at Dan'l, and says again, very deliberate, "Well," he says, "I don't see no p'ints about that frog that's any better'n any other frog." Smiley he stood scratching his head and looking down at Daniel a long time, and at last he says, "I do wonder what in the nation that frog throwed off for. I wonder if there ain't something the matter with him. He 'pears to look mighty baggy, somehow." And he ketched Daniel by the nape of the neck, and hefted him, and says, "Why, blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pound!" and turned him upside down, and he belched out a double handful of shot. And then he see how it was, and he was the maddest man. He set the frog down, and took out after that feller, but he never ketched him. The resemblances are deliciously exact. There you have the wily Boeotian and the wily Jim Smiley waiting, 2,000 years apart, and waiting, each equipped with his frog, and laying for the stranger. A contest is proposed, for money. The Athenian would take a chance if the other would fetch him a frog. The Yankee says, "I'm only a stranger here, and I ain't got a frog, but if I had a frog I'd bet you." The wily Boeotian and the wily Californian, with that vast gulf of 2,000 years between, retire eagerly and go frogging in the marsh. The Athenian and the Yankee remain behind and work a best advantage, the one with pebbles, the other with shot. Presently the contest began. In the one case they pinched the Boeotian frog. In the other, him and the feller touched up the frogs from behind. The Boeotian frog gathered himself for a leap. You can just see him, but could not move his body in the least. The Californian frog give a heave, but it warn't no use, he couldn't budge. In both the ancient and the modern cases the strangers departed with the money. The Boeotian and the Californian wonder what is the matter with their frogs. They lift them and examine, they turn them upside down, and out spills the informing ballast. Yes, the resemblances are curiously exact. I used to tell the story of the jumping frog in San Francisco, and presently Artemus Ward came along and wanted it to help fill out a little book which he was about to publish. So I wrote it out and sent it to his publisher, Carleton, but Carleton thought the book had enough matter in it, so he gave the story to Henry Clapp as a present, and Clapp put it in his Saturday Press, and it killed that paper with a suddenness that was beyond praise. At least the paper died with that issue, and none but envious people have ever tried to rob me of the honor and credit of killing it. The Jumping Frog was the first piece of writing of mine that spread itself through the newspapers and brought me into public notice. Consequently, the Saturday Press was a cocoon, and I the worm in it. Also, I was the gay-colored literary moth which its death set free. This simile has been used before. Early in '66, The Jumping Frog was issued in book form with other sketches of mine. A year or two later, Madame Blanc translated it into French and published it in the Revue des Deux Mondes, but the result was not what should have been expected, for the Revue struggled along and pulled through, and is alive yet. I think the fault must have been in the translation. I ought to have translated it myself. I think so because I examined into the matter and finally retranslated the sketch from the French back into English to see what the trouble was. That is, to see just what sort of a focus the French people got upon it. Then the mystery was explained. In French the story is too confused and chaotic and unreposeful and ungrammatical and insane. Consequently, it could only cause grief and sickness. It could not kill. A glance at my retranslation will show the reader that this must be true. My retranslation. The Frog Jumping of the County of Calaveras. Eh bien, this Smiley nourished some terriers et rats, and some cocks of combat, and some cats, and all sorts of things, and with his rage of betting one no had more of repose. He trapped one day a frog, and him imported with him, et l'emporta chez lui, saying that he pretended to make his education. You me believe if you will, but during 3 months he not has nothing done but to him apprehend to jump, apprendre à sauter, in a court retired of her mansion, de sa maison, and you respond that he have succeeded. He him gives a small blow by behind, and the instant after you shall see the frog turn in the air like a grease biscuit, make one somersault, sometimes two, when she was well started, and re-fall upon his feet like a cat. He him had accomplished in the art of to gobble the flies, gober des mouches, and him there exercised continually, so well that a fly at the most far that she appeared was a fly lost. Smiley had custom to say that all which lacked to a frog it was the education, but with the education she could do nearly all, and I him believe. Tenez, I him have seen pose Daniel Webster there upon this plank, Daniel Webster was the name of the frog, and to him sing, "Some flies, Daniel, some flies." In a flash of the eye Daniel had bounded and seized a fly here upon the counter, then jumped anew at the earth, where he rested truly to himself, scratched the head with his behind foot, as if he no had not the least idea of his superiority. Never you not have seen frog as modest, as natural, sweet as she was, and when he himself agitated to jump purely and simply upon plain earth, she does more ground in one jump than any beast of his species than you can know. To jump plain, this was his strong. When he himself agitated for that Smiley multiplied the bests upon her as long as there to him remained a red. It must to know Smiley was monstrously proud of his frog, and he of it was right, for some men who were traveled, who had all seen, said that they to him would be injurious to him compared to another frog. Smiley guarded Daniel in a little box latticed, which he carried betimes to the village for some bet. One day an individual stranger at the camp him arrested with his box, and him said, "What is this that you have then shut up there within?" Smiley said, with an air indifferent, "That could be a paroquet, or a syringe, ou un serin, but this no is nothing of such, it not is but a frog." The individual it took, it regarded with care, it turned from one side and from the other, then he said, "Tiens, in effect, At what is she good?" "My God," responded Smiley, always with an air disengaged, "she is good for one thing, to my notice (à mon avis). She can better in jumping (elle peut batter en sauter) all frogs of the county of Calaveras." The individual retook the box, it examined of new longly, and it rendered to Smiley in saying, with an air deliberate, "Eh bien, I no saw not that that frog had nothing of better than each frog. Je ne vois pas que cette grenouille ait rien de mieux qu'aucune grenouille." If that isn't grammar gone to seed, then I count myself no judge. M.T. "Possible that you not it saw not," said Smiley. "Possible that you comprehend frogs. Possible that you not you there comprehend nothing. Possible that you had of the experience, and possible that you not be but an amateur. Of all manner, de toute manière, I bet $40 that she batter in jumping no matter which frog of the county of Calaveras." The individual reflected a second, and said like sad, "I not am but a stranger here, I no have not a frog, but if I of it had one, I would embrace the bet." "Strong! Well," respond Smiley, "nothing of more facility. If you will hold my box a minute, I go you to search a frog. J'irai vous chercher." Behold, then, the individual who guards the box, who puts his $40 upon those of Smiley, and who attends, et qui attendre. He attended enough long times, reflecting all solely. And figure you that he takes Daniel, him opens the mouth by force, and with a teaspoon him fills with shot of the hunt, even him fills just to the chin, then he him puts by the earth. Smiley during these times was at slopping in a swamp. Finally he trapped (attrape) a frog, him carried to that individual, and said, "Now, if you be ready, put him all against Daniel, with their before feet upon the same line, and I give the signal." Then he added, "1, 2, 3, advance." Him and the individual touched their frogs by behind, and the frog knew but to jump smartly. But Daniel himself lifted ponderously, exalted the shoulders thus, like a Frenchman, to what good? He could not budge. He is planted solid like a church. He not advance no more than if one him had put at the anchor. Smiley was surprised and disgusted, but he not himself doubted not of the turn being intended, mais il ne se doutait pas du tour bien entendre. The individual impocketed the silver, himself with it went, and of it himself in going is that he no gives not a jerk of the thumb over the shoulder like that, at the poor Daniel, in saying with his air deliberate, "L'individu empoche l'argent, s'en va, et en s'en allant, est-ce qu'il ne donne pas un coup de poche par-dessus l'épaule, comme ça, au pauvre Daniel, en disant de son air délibéré, eh bien, I no see not that that frog has nothing of better than another." Smiley himself scratched long times the head, the eyes fixed upon Daniel, until that which at last he said, "I me demand how the devil it makes itself that this beast has refused. Is it that she had something? One would believe that she is stuffed." He grasped Daniel by the skin of the neck, him lifted, and said, "The wolf me bite if he no weigh not 5 pounds." He him reversed, and the unhappy belched 2 handfuls of shot. Et le malheureux, etc. When Smiley recognized how it was, he was like mad. He deposited his frog by the earth, and ran after that individual, but he not him caught, never. It may be that there are people who can translate better than I can, but I am not acquainted with them. So ends the private and public history of the Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, an incident which has this unique feature about it, that it is both old and new, a chestnut and not a chestnut, for it was original when it happened 2,000 years ago, and was again original when it happened in California in our own time. P.S. London, July 1900. Twice recently I have been asked this question: "Have you seen the Greek version of the Jumping Frog?" And twice I have answered, "No." Has Professor Van Dyke seen it? I suppose so. Then your supposition is at fault. Why? Because there isn't any such version. Do you mean to intimate that the tale is modern and not borrowed from some ancient Greek book? Yes, it is not permissible for any but the very young and innocent to be so easily beguiled as you and Van Dyke have been. Do you mean that we have fallen a prey to our ignorance and simplicity? Yes. Is Van Dyke a Greek scholar? I believe so. Then he knew where to find the ancient Greek version if one existed. Why didn't he look? Why did he jump to conclusions? I don't know. And was it worth the trouble anyway? As it turns out, now, it was not claimed that the story had been translated from the Greek. It had its place among other uncredited stories, and was there to be turned into Greek by students of that language. Greek prose composition, that title, is what made the confusion. It seemed to mean that the originals were Greek. It was not well chosen, for it was pretty sure to mislead. Thus vanishes the Greek frog, and I am sorry, for he loomed fine and grand across the sweep of the ages, and I took a great pride in him. M.T. End of the private history of the Jumping Frog story, and end of segment 30 of The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg and Other Stories by Mark Twain.
This is My Military Campaign. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg and Other Stories by Mark Twain. Segment 31. My Military Campaign.
You have heard from a great many people who did something in the war. Is it not fair and right that you listen a little moment to one who started out to do something in it, but didn't? Thousands entered the war, got just a taste of it, and then stepped out again permanently. These, by their very numbers, are respectable, and are therefore entitled to a sort of voice, not a loud one, but a modest one, not a boastful one, but an apologetic one. They ought not to be allowed much space among better people, people who did something, I grant that. But they ought at least to be allowed to state why they didn't do anything, and also to explain the process by which they didn't do anything. Surely this kind of light must have a sort of value. Out West there was a good deal of confusion in men's minds during the first months of the great trouble, a good deal of unsettledness, of leaning first this way, then that, then the other way. It was hard for us to get our bearings. I call to mind an instance of this. I was piloting on the Mississippi when the news came that South Carolina had gone out of the Union on December 20, 1860. My pilot mate was a New Yorker. He was strong for the Union. So was I. But he would not listen to me with any patience. My loyalty was smirched to his eye because my father had owned slaves. I said, in palliation of this dark fact, that I had heard my father say, some years before he died, that slavery was a great wrong, and that he would free the solitary negro he then owned if he could think it right to give away the property of the family when he was so straitened in means. My mate retorted that a mere impulse was nothing. Anybody could pretend to a good impulse, and went on decrying my Unionism and libeling my ancestry. A month later, the secession atmosphere had considerably thickened on the lower Mississippi, and I became a rebel. So did he. We were together in New Orleans, January 26, when Louisiana went out of the Union. He did his full share of the rebel shouting, but was bitterly opposed to letting me do mine. He said that I came of bad stock, of a father who had been willing to set slaves free. In the following summer he was piloting a Federal gunboat and shouting for the Union again, and I was in the Confederate Army. I held his note for some borrowed money. He was one of the most upright men I ever knew, but he repudiated that note without hesitation because I was a rebel and the son of a man who had owned slaves. In that summer of 1861 the first wash of the wave of war broke upon the shores of Missouri. Our state was invaded by the Union forces. They took possession of St. Louis.
Jefferson Barracks, and some other points. The governor, Clabe Jackson, issued his proclamation calling out 50,000 militia to repel the invader. I was visiting the small town where my boyhood had been spent, Hannibal, Marion County. Several of us got together in a secret place by night and formed ourselves into a military company. One Tom Lyman, a young fellow of a good deal of spirit but of no military experience, was made captain. I was made second lieutenant. We had no first lieutenant. I do not know why. It was long ago. There were 15 of us. By the advice of an innocent connected with the organization, we called ourselves the Marion Rangers. I do not remember that any one found fault with the name. I did not. I thought it sounded quite well. The young fellow who proposed this title was perhaps a fair sample of the kind of stuff we were made of. He was young, ignorant, good-natured, well-meaning, trivial, full of romance, and given to reading chivalric novels and singing forlorn love ditties. He had some pathetic little nickel-plated aristocratic instincts, and detested his name, which was Dunlap. Detested it, partly because it was nearly as common in that region as Smith, but mainly because it had a plebeian sound to his ear. So he tried to ennoble it by writing it in this way, D. Unlap. That contented his eye, but left his ear unsatisfied, for people gave the new name the same old pronunciation, emphasis on the front end of it. He then did the bravest thing that can be imagined, a thing to make one shiver when one remembers how the world is given to resenting shams and affectations. He began to write his name so, Dunlap, and he waited patiently through the long storm of mud that was flung at this work of art, and he had his reward at last, for he lived to see that name accepted, and the emphasis put where he wanted it, by people who had known him all his life, and to whom the tribe of Dunlaps had been as familiar as the rain and the sunshine for 40 years. So sure of victory at last is the courage that can wait. He said he had found, by consulting some ancient French chronicles, that the name was rightly and originally written Dunlap, and said that if it were translated into English it would mean Peterson. Lap, Latin or Greek, he said, for stone or rock, same as the French Pierre, that is to say, Peter. D apostrophe of or from, un, a or one, hence Dunlap, of or from a stone, or a Peter, that is to say, one who is the son of a stone, the son of a Peter, Peter's son. Our militia company were not learned, and the explanation confused them, so they called him Peterson Dunlap. He proved useful to us in his way. He named our camps for us, and he generally struck a name that was no slouch, as the boys said. That is one sample of us. Another was Ed Stevens, son of the town jeweler, trim-built, handsome, graceful, neat as a cat, bright, educated, but given over entirely to fun. There was nothing serious in life to him. As far as he was concerned, this military expedition of ours was simply a holiday. I should say that about half of us looked upon it in the same way, not consciously, perhaps, but unconsciously. We did not think, we were not capable of it. As for myself, I was full of unreasoning joy to be done with turning out of bed at midnight and 4 in the morning for a while, grateful to have a change, new scenes, new occupations, a new interest. In my thoughts, that was as far as I went. I did not go into the details. As a rule, one doesn't at 25. Another sample was Smith, the blacksmith's apprentice. This vast donkey had some pluck, of a slow and sluggish nature, but a soft heart. At one time he would knock a horse down for some impropriety, and at another he would get homesick and cry. However, he had one ultimate credit to his account which some of us hadn't. He stuck to the war, and was killed in battle at last. Joe Bowers, another sample, was a huge, good-natured, flax-headed lubber, lazy, sentimental, full of harmless brag, a grumbler by nature, an experienced, industrious, ambitious, and often quite picturesque liar, and yet not a successful one, for he had had no intelligent training, but was allowed to come up just anyway. This life was serious enough to him, and seldom satisfactory. But he was a good fellow, anyway, and the boys all liked him. He was made orderly sergeant.
Stevens was made corporal. These samples will answer, and they are quite fair ones. Well, this herd of cattle started for the war. What could you expect of them? They did as well as they knew how, but really, what was justly to be expected of them? Nothing, I should say. That is what they did. We waited for a dark night, for caution and secrecy were necessary. Then, toward midnight, we stole in couples and from various directions to the Griffith place, beyond the town. From that point we set out together on foot. Hannibal lies at the extreme southeastern corner of Marion County on the Mississippi River. Our objective point was the hamlet of New London, 10 miles away, in Ralls County. The first hour was all fun, all idle nonsense and laughter, but that could not be kept up. The steady trudging came to be like work. The play had somehow oozed out of it. The stillness of the woods and the somberness of the night began to throw a depressing influence over the spirits of the boys, and presently the talking died out and each person shut himself up in his own thoughts. During the last half of the second hour nobody said a word. Now we approached a log farmhouse where, according to report, there was a guard of 5 Union soldiers. Lyman called a halt, and there, in the deep gloom of the overhanging branches, he began to whisper a plan of assault upon that house, which made the gloom more depressing than it was before. It was a crucial moment, we realized, with a cold suddenness, that there was no jest. We were standing face to face with actual war. We were equal to the occasion. In our response there was no hesitation, no indecision. We said that if Lyman wanted to meddle with those soldiers, he could go ahead and do it. But if he waited for us to follow him, he would wait a long time. Lyman urged, pleaded, tried to shame us, but it had no effect. Our course was plain. Our minds were made up. We would flank the farmhouse, go out around. And that is what we did. We turned the position. We struck into the woods and entered upon a rough time, stumbling over roots, getting tangled in vines and torn by briars. At last we reached an open place in a safe region and sat down, blown and hot, to cool off and nurse our scratches and bruises. Lyman was annoyed, but the rest of us were cheerful. We had flanked the farmhouse. We had made our first military movement, and it was a success. We had nothing to fret about. We were feeling just the other way. Horseplay and laughing began again. The expedition was become a holiday frolic once more. Then we had 2 more hours of dull trudging and ultimate silence and depression. Then, about dawn, we straggled into New London, soiled, heel-blistered, fagged with our little march, and all of us except Stevens in a sour and raspy humor and privately down on the war. We stacked our shabby old shotguns in Colonel Rall's barn, and then went in a body and breakfasted with that veteran of the Mexican War. Afterwards he took us to a distant meadow, and there in the shade of a tree we listened to an old-fashioned speech from him, full of gunpowder and glory, full of that adjective-piling mixed metaphor and windy declamations which was regarded as eloquence in that ancient time and that remote region. And then he swore us on the Bible to be faithful to the state of Missouri and drive all invaders from her soil, no matter whence they might come or under what flag they might march. This mixed us considerably, and we could not make out just what service we were embarked in. But Colonel Ralls, the practiced politician and phrase-juggler, was not similarly in doubt. He knew quite clearly that he had invested us in the cause of the Southern Confederacy. He closed the solemnities by belting around me the sword which his neighbor, Colonel Brown, had worn at Buena Vista and Molino del Rey, and he accompanied this act with another impressive blast. Then we formed in line of battle and marched 4 miles to a shady and pleasant piece of woods on the border of the far-reached expanses of flowery prairie. It was an enchanting region for war, our kind of war. We pierced the forest about half a mile and took up a strong position, with some low, rocky, and wooded hills behind us, and a purling, limpid creek in front. Straightway half the command were in swimming, and the other half fishing. The ass with the French name gave this position a romantic title, but it was too long, so the boys shortened and simplified it to Camp Ralls. We occupied an old maple sugar camp, whose half-rotted troughs were still propped against the trees. A long corn crib served for sleeping quarters for the battalion. On our left, half a mile away, was Mason's farm and house, and he was a friend to the cause.
Shortly after noon the farmers began to arrive from several directions with mules and horses for our use, and these they lent us for as long as the war might last, which they judged would be about 3 months. The animals were of all sizes, all colors, and all breeds. They were mainly young and frisky, and nobody in the command could stay on them long at a time. For we were town boys, and ignorant of horsemanship. The creature that fell to my share was a very small mule, and yet so quick and active that it could throw me without difficulty. And it did this whenever I got on it. Then it would bray, stretching its neck out, laying its ears back, and spreading its jaws till you could see down to its works. It was a disagreeable animal in every way. If I took it by the bridle and tried to lead it off the grounds, it would sit down and brace back, and no one could budge it. However, I was not entirely destitute of military resources, and I did presently manage to spoil this game, for I had seen many a steamboat aground in my time, and knew a trick or two which even a grounded mule would be obliged to respect. There was a well by the corn-crib, so I substituted 30 fathoms of rope for the bridle, and fetched him home with the windlass. I will anticipate here sufficiently to say that we did learn to ride, after some days' practice, but never well. We could not learn to like our animals, they were not choice ones, and most of them had annoying peculiarities of one kind or another. Stephen's horse would carry him, when he was not noticing, under the huge excrescences which form on the trunks of oak trees, and wipe him out of the saddle. In this way Stevens got several bad hurts. Sergeant Bower's horse was very large and tall, with slim, long legs, and looked like a railroad bridge. His size enabled him to reach all about, and as far as he wanted to, with his head, so he was always biting Bower's legs. On the march, in the sun, Bower slept a good deal, and as soon as the horse recognized that he was asleep, he would reach around and bite him on the leg. His legs were black and blue with bites. This was the only thing that could ever make him swear, but this always did. Whenever the horse bit him, he always swore, and of course Stevens, who laughed at everything, laughed at this, and would even get into such convulsions over it as to lose his balance and fall off his horse. And then Bowers, already irritated by the pain of the horse bite, would resent the laughter with hard language, and there would be a quarrel. So that horse made no end of trouble and bad blood in the command. However, I will get back to where I was, our first afternoon in the sugar camp. The sugar troughs came very handy as horse troughs, and we had plenty of corn to fill them with. I ordered Sergeant Bowers to feed my mule, but he said that if I reckoned he went to war to be dry nurse to a mule, it wouldn't take me very long to find out my mistake. I believed that this was insubordination, but I was full of uncertainties about everything military, and so I let the thing pass, and went and ordered Smith, the blacksmith's apprentice, to feed the mule. But he merely gave me a large, cold, sarcastic grin, such as an ostensibly 7-year-old horse gives you when you lift his lip and find he is 14, and turned his back on me. I then went to the captain and asked if it was not right and proper and military for me to have an orderly. He said it was, but as there was only one orderly in the corps, it was but right that he himself should have Bowers on his staff. Bowers said he wouldn't serve on anybody's staff, and if anybody thought he could make him, let him try it. So of course the thing had to be dropped. There was no other way. Next, nobody would cook. It was considered a degradation, so we had no dinner. We lazied the rest of the pleasant afternoon away, some dozing under the trees, some smoking cob pipes and talking sweethearts and war, some playing games. By late supper time all hands were famished, and to meet the difficulty all hands turned to on an equal footing and gathered wood, built fires, and cooked the meal. Afterward everything was smooth for a while, then trouble broke out between the corporal and the sergeant, each claiming to rank the other. Nobody knew which was the higher office, so Lyman had to settle the matter by making the rank of both officers equal. The commander of an ignorant crew like that has many troubles and vexations which probably do not occur in the regular army at all. However, with the song-singing and yarn-spinning around the campfire, everything presently became serene again, and by we raked the corn down level in one end of the crib, and all went to bed on it, tying a horse to the door so that he would neigh if anyone tried to get in. Note 1. It was always my impression that that was what the horse was there for, and I know that it was also the impression of at least one other of the command, for we talked about it at the time, and admired the military ingenuity of the device. But when I was out West 3 years ago, I was told by Mr. A. G. Fuqua, a member of our company, that the horse was his, that the leaving him tied at the door was a matter of mere forgetfulness, and that to attribute it to intelligent invention was to give him quite too much credit. In support of his position, he called my attention to the suggestive fact that the artifice was not employed again. I had not thought of that before. End of Note 1. We had some horsemanship drill every forenoon. Then afternoons we rode off here and there in squads a few miles, and visited the farmers' girls, and had a youthful good time, and got an honest good dinner or supper, and then home again to camp, happy and content. For a time life was idly delicious. It was perfect. There was nothing to mar it. Then came some farmers with an alarm one day. They said it was rumored that the enemy were advancing in our direction, from over Hyde's Prairie. The result was a sharp stir among us, and general consternation. It was a rude awakening from our pleasant trance. The rumor was but a rumor, nothing definite about it, so in the confusion we did not know which way to retreat. Lyman was for not retreating at all, in these uncertain circumstances, but he found that if he tried to maintain that attitude he would fare badly, for the command were in no humor to put up with insubordination. So he yielded the point and called a council of war, to consist of himself and the 3 other officers, but the privates made such a fuss about being left out that we had to allow them to remain, for they were already present, and doing the most of the talking too. The question was, which way to retreat, but all were so flurried that nobody seemed to have even a guess to offer, except Lyman. He explained in a few calm words that inasmuch as the enemy were approaching from over Hyde's Prairie, our course was simple. All we had to do was not to retreat toward him. Any other direction would answer our needs perfectly. Everybody saw in a moment how true this was, and how wise. So Lyman got a great many compliments. It was now decided that we should fall back upon Mason's farm. It was after dark by this time, and as we could not know how soon the enemy might arrive, it did not seem best to try to take the horses and things with us. So we only took the guns and ammunition, and started at once. The route was very rough and hilly and rocky, and presently the night grew very black, and rain began to fall, so we had a troublesome time of it, struggling and stumbling along in the dark, and soon some person slipped and fell, and then the next person behind stumbled over him and fell, and so did the rest, one after the other, and then Bowers came with the keg of powder in his arms, whilst the command were all mixed together, arms and legs, on the muddy slope, and so he fell, of course, with the keg, and this started the whole detachment down the hill in a body, and they landed in the brook at the bottom in a pile, and each that was undermost pulling the hair and scratching and biting those that were on top of him, and those that were being scratched and bitten scratching and biting the rest in their turn, and all saying they would die before they would ever go to war again, if they ever got out of this brook this time, and the invader might rot for all they cared, and the country along with them, and all such talk as that, which was dismal to hear and take part in such smothered low voices, and such a grisly dark place, and so wet, and the enemy maybe coming any moment. The keg of powder was lost, and the guns too, so the growling and complaining continued straight along whilst the brigade pawed around the pasty hillside and slopped around in the brook hunting for these things. Consequently we lost considerable time at this, and then we heard a sound, and held our breath and listened, and it seemed to be the enemy coming, though it could have been a cow, for it had a cough like a cow. But we did not wait, but left a couple of guns behind and struck out for Mason's again as briskly as we could scramble along in the dark. But we got lost presently among the rugged little ravines, and wasted a deal of time finding the way again, so it was after 9 when we reached Mason's stile at last, and then before we could open our mouths to give the countersign, several dogs came bounding over the fence with great riot and noise, and each of them took a soldier by the slack of his trousers and began to back away with him. We could not shoot the dogs without endangering the persons they were attached to, so we had to look on helplessly at what was perhaps the most mortifying spectacle of the Civil War. There was light enough and to spare, for the Masons had now run out on the porch with candles in their hands. The old man and his son came and undid the dogs without difficulty, all but Bowers, but they couldn't undo his dog. They didn't know his combination. He was of the bull kind, and seemed to be set with a Yale time lock, but they got him loose at last with some scalding water, of which Bowers got his share and returned thanks. Peterson Dunlap afterwards made up a fine name for this engagement, and also for the night march which preceded it, but both have long ago faded out of my memory. We now went into the house, and they began to ask us a world of questions, whereby it presently came out that we did not know anything concerning who or what we were running from, so the old gentleman made himself very frank, and said we were a curious breed of soldiers, and guessed we could be depended on to end up the war in time, because no government could stand the expense of the shoe-leather we should cost it, trying to follow us around. "Marion Rangers, good name, b'gosh," said he, and wanted to know why we hadn't had a picket guard at the place where the road entered the prairie, and why we hadn't sent out a scouting party to spy out the enemy and bring us an account of his strength, and so on, before jumping up and stampeding out of a strong position upon a mere vague rumor, and so on and so forth, till he made us all feel shabbier than the dogs had done, and not half so enthusiastically welcome. So we went to bed shamed and low-spirited, except Stevens. Soon Stevens began to devise a garment for Bowers, which could be made to automatically display his battle scars to the grateful, or conceal them from the envious, according to his occasions. But Bowers was in no humor for this, so there was a fight, and when it was over Stevens had some battle scars of his own to think about. Then we got a little sleep, but after all we had gone through, our activities were not over for the night. For about 2 o'clock in the morning we heard a shout of warning from down the lane, accompanied by a chorus from all the dogs, and in a moment everybody was up and flying around to find out what the alarm was about. The alarmist was a horseman who gave notice that a detachment of Union soldiers was on its way from Hannibal, with orders to capture and hang any bands like ours which it could find, and said we had no time to lose. Farmer Mason was in a flurry this time himself. He hurried us out of the house with all haste, and sent one of his negroes with us to show us where to hide ourselves and our telltale guns among the ravines half a mile away. It was raining heavily. We struck down the lane, then across some rocky pasture land which offered good advantages for stumbling. Consequently we were down in the mud most of the time, and every time a man went down he blackguarded the war, and the people who started it, and everybody connected with it, and gave himself the master dose of all for being so foolish as to go into it. At last we reached the wooded mouth of a ravine, and there we huddled ourselves under the streaming trees and sent the negro back home. It was a dismal and heart-breaking time. We were like to be drowned with the rain, deafened with the howling wind and the booming thunder, and blinded by the lightning. It was indeed a wild night. The drenching we were getting was misery enough, but a deeper misery still was the reflection that the halter might end us before we were a day older. A death of this shameful sort had not occurred to us as being among the possibilities of war. It took the romance out of all of the campaign, and turned our dreams of glory into a repulsive nightmare. As for doubting that so barbarous an order had been given, not one of us did that. The long night wore itself out at last, and then the negro came to us with the news that the alarm had manifestly been a false one, and that breakfast would soon be ready. Straightway we were light-hearted again, and the world was bright, and life as full of hope and promise as ever, for we were young then. How long ago that was! 24 years. The mongrel child of philology named the night's refuge Camp Devastation, and no soul objected. The Masons gave us a Missouri country breakfast, in Missouri in abundance, and we needed it. Hot biscuits, hot wheat bread, prettily crisscrossed in a lattice pattern on top, hot corn pone, fried chicken, bacon, coffee, eggs, milk, buttermilk, etc., and the world may be confidently challenged to furnish the equal to such a breakfast as it is cooked in the South. We stayed several days at Mason's, and after all these years the memory of the dullness, the stillness, and lifelessness of that slumberous farmhouse still oppresses my spirit as with a sense of the presence of death and mourning. There was nothing to do, nothing to think about. There was no interest in life. The male part of the household were away in the fields all day. The women were busy and out of our sight. There was no sound but the plaintive wailing of the spinning-wheel, forever moaning out from some distant room, the most lonesome sound in nature, a sound steeped and sodden with homesickness and the emptiness of life.
The family went to bed about dark every night, and as we were not invited to intrude any new customs, we naturally followed theirs. Those nights were 100 years long to youths accustomed to being up till 12. We lay awake and miserable till that hour every time, and grew old and decrepit waiting through the still eternities for the clock strikes. This was no place for town boys. So at last it was with something very like joy that we received news that the enemy were on our track again. With a new birth of the old warrior spirit, we sprang to our places in line of battle and fell back on Camp Ralls. Captain Lyman had taken a hint from Mason's talk, and he now gave order that our camp should be guarded against surprise by the posting of pickets. I was ordered to place a picket at the forks of the road in Hyde's Prairie. Night shut down black and threatening. I told Sergeant Bowers to go out to that place and stay till midnight, and just as I was expecting, he said he wouldn't do it. I tried to get others to go, but all refused. Some excused themselves on account of the weather, but the rest were frank enough to say they wouldn't go in any kind of weather. This kind of thing sounds odd now, and impossible, but it seemed a perfectly natural thing to do. There were scores of little camps scattered over Missouri where the same thing was happening. These camps were composed of young men who had been born and reared to a sturdy independence, and who did not know what it meant to be ordered around by Tom, Dick, and Harry, whom they had known familiarly all their lives in the village or on the farm. It is quite within the probabilities that this same thing was happening all over the South. James Redpath recognized the justice of this assumption, and furnished the following instance in support of it. During a short stay in East Tennessee, he was in a citizen colonel's tent one day, talking, when a big private appeared at the door, and without salute or other circumlocution said to the colonel, "Say, Jim, I'm a-going home for a few days." "What for?" "Well, I hain't been there for a right smart while, and I'd like to see how things is coming on." "How long are you going to be gone?" "About 2 weeks." "Well, don't be gone longer than that, and get back sooner if you can." That was all, and the citizen officer resumed his conversation where the private had broken it off. This was the first months of the war, of course. The camps in our part of Missouri were under Brigadier General Thomas H. Harris. He was a townsman of ours, a first-rate fellow, and well liked. But we had all familiarly known him as the sole and modest salaried operator in our telegraph office, where he had to send about 1 dispatch a week in ordinary times, and 2 when there was a rush of business. Consequently, when he appeared in our midst one day on the wing and delivered a military command of some sort in a large military fashion, nobody was surprised at the response which he got from the assembled soldiery. "Oh, now, what'll you take to don't, Tom Harris?" It was quite the natural thing. One might justly imagine that we were hopeless material for war, and so we seemed, in our ignorant state. But there were those among us who afterward learned the grim trade, learned to obey like machines, became valuable soldiers, fought all through the war, and came out at the end with excellent records. One of the very boys who refused to go out on picket duty that night, and called me an ass for thinking he would expose himself to danger in such a foolhardy way, had become distinguished for intrepidity before he was a year older. I did secure my picket that night, not by authority, but by diplomacy. I got Bowers to go, by agreeing to exchange ranks with him for the time being, and go along and stand the watch with him as his subordinate. We stayed out there a couple of dreary hours in the pitchy darkness and the rain, with nothing to modify the dreariness but Bowers' monotonous growlings at the war and the weather. Then we began to nod, and presently found it next to impossible to stay in the saddle. So we gave up the tedious job and went back to the camp without waiting for the relief guard. We rode into camp without interruption or objection from anybody, and the enemy could have done the same, for there were no sentries. Everybody was asleep. At midnight there was nobody to send out another picket, so none was sent. We never tried to establish a watch at night again, as far as I remember, but we generally kept a picket out in the daytime. In that camp the whole command slept on the corn in the big corn crib, and there was usually a general row before morning, for the place was full of rats, and they would scramble over the boys' bodies and faces, annoying and irritating everybody, and now and then they would bite someone's toe, and the person who owned the toe would start up and magnify his English and begin to throw corn in the dark. The ears were half as heavy as bricks, and when they struck they hurt. The person struck would respond, and inside of 5 minutes every man would be locked in a death grip with his neighbor. There was a grievous deal of blood shed in the corn crib, but this was all that was spilt while I was in the war. No, that is not quite true, but for one circumstance it would have been all. I will come to that now. Our scares were frequent. Every few days rumors would come that the enemy were approaching. In these cases we always fell back on some other camp of ours. We never stayed where we were. But the rumors always turned out to be false, so at last even we began to grow indifferent to them. One night a negro was sent to our corn crib with the same old warning: the enemy was hovering in our neighborhood. We all said, let him hover. We resolved to stay still and be comfortable. It was a fine warlike resolution, and no doubt we all felt the stir of it in our veins for a moment. We had been having a very jolly time, that was full of horseplay and schoolboy hilarity, but that cooled down now, and presently the fast waning fire of forced jokes and forced laughs died out altogether, and the company became silent and nervous, and soon uneasy, worried, apprehensive. We had said we would stay, and we were committed. We could have been persuaded to go, but there was nobody brave enough to suggest it. An almost noiseless movement presently began in the dark, by a general and unvoiced impulse. When the movement was completed, each man knew that he was not the only person who had crept to the front wall and had his eye at a crack between the logs. No, we were all there with our hearts in our throats, and staring out toward the sugar troughs where the forest footpath came through. It was late, and there was a deep woodsy stillness everywhere. There was a veiled moonlight which was only just strong enough to enable us to mark the general shape of objects. Presently a muffled sound caught our ears, and we recognized it as the hoof-beats of a horse or horses, and right away a figure appeared in the forest path. It could have been made of smoke, its mass had so little sharpness of outline. It was a man on horseback, and it seemed to me that there were others behind him. I got hold of a gun in the dark, and pushed it through a crack between the logs, hardly knowing what I was doing. I was so dazed with fright, somebody said, "Fire!" and I pulled the trigger. I seemed to see 100 flashes and hear 100 reports. Then I saw the man fall down out of the saddle. My first feeling was of surprised gratification. My first impulse was an apprentice sportsman's impulse to run and pick up his game. Somebody said, hardly audibly, "Good, we got him. Wait for the rest." But the rest did not come. There was not a sound, not the whisper of a leaf, just perfect stillness, an uncanny kind of stillness, which was all the more uncanny on account of the damp, earthy, late-night smells now rising and pervading it. Then, wondering, we crept stealthily out and approached the man. When we got to him, the moon revealed him distinctly. He was lying on his back, with his arms abroad. His mouth was open and his chest heaving with long gasps, and his white shirt-front was all splashed with blood. The thought shot through me that I was a murderer, that I had killed a man who had never done me any harm. That was the coldest sensation that ever went through my marrow. I was down by him in a moment, helplessly stroking his forehead, and I would have given anything then, my own life freely, to make him again what he had been 5 minutes before. And all the boys seemed to be feeling in the same way. They hung over him, full of pitying interest, and tried all they could to help him, and said all sorts of regretful things. They had forgotten all about the enemy. They thought only of this one forlorn unit of the foe. Once my imagination persuaded me that the dying man gave me a reproachful look out of his shadowy eyes, and it seemed to me that I would rather he had stabbed me than done that. He muttered and mumbled like a dreamer in his sleep about his wife and child, and I thought with a new despair, this thing that I have done does not end with him, it falls upon them too, and they never did me any harm any more than he. In a little while the man was dead. He was killed in war, killed in fair and legitimate war, killed in battle, as you might say, and yet he was as sincerely mourned by the opposing force as if he had been their brother. The boys stood there a half-hour sorrowing over him and recalling the details of the tragedy, and wondering who he might be, and if he were a spy, and saying that if it were to do over again they would not hurt him unless he attacked them first. It soon came out that mine was not the only shot fired. There were 5 others.
a division of the guilt which was a grateful relief to me, since it in some degree lightened and diminished the burden I was carrying. There were 6 shots fired at once, but I was not in my right mind at the time, and my heated imagination had magnified my one shot into a volley. The man was not in uniform, and was not armed. He was a stranger in the country. That was all we ever found out about him. The thought of him got to preying upon me every night. I could not get rid of it. I could not drive it away. The taking of that unoffending life seemed such a wanton thing, and it seemed an epitome of war, that all war must be just that, the killing of strangers against whom you feel no personal animosity, strangers whom, in other circumstances, you would help if you found them in trouble, and who would help you if you needed it. My campaign was spoiled. It seemed to me that I was not rightly equipped for this awful business, that war was intended for men, and I for a child's nurse. I resolved to retire from this avocation of sham soldiership while I could save some remnant of my self-respect. These morbid thoughts clung to me against reason, for at bottom I did not believe I had touched that man. The law of probabilities decreed me guiltless of his blood, for in all my small experience with guns I had never hit anything I had tried to hit, and I knew I had done my best to hit him. Yet there was no solace in the thought. Against a diseased imagination, demonstration goes for nothing. The rest of my war experience was of a piece with what I have already told of it. We kept monotonously falling back upon one camp or another, and eating up the country. I marvel now at the patience of the farmers and their families. They ought to have shot us. On the contrary, they were as hospitably kind and courteous to us as if we had deserved it. In one of these camps we found Ab Grimes, an upper Mississippi pilot, who afterwards became famous as a daredevil rebel spy, whose career bristled with desperate adventures. The look and style of his comrades suggested that they had not come into the war to play, and their deeds made good the conjecture later. They were fine horsemen and good revolver shots, but their favorite arm was the lasso. Each had one at his pommel, and could snatch a man out of the saddle with it every time, on a full gallop, at any reasonable distance. In another camp the chief was a fierce and profane old blacksmith of 60, and he had furnished his 20 recruits with gigantic home-made bowie knives to be swung with the 2 hands like the machetes of the Isthmus. It was a grisly spectacle to see that earnest band practicing their murderous cuts and slashes under the eye of that remorseless old fanatic. The last camp which we fell back upon was in a hollow near the village of Florida, where I was born, in Monroe County. Here we were warned, one day, that a Union colonel was sweeping down on us with a whole regiment at his heels. This looked decidedly serious. Our boys went apart and consulted. Then we went back and told the other companies present that the war was a disappointment to us, and we were going to disband. They were getting ready themselves to fall back on some place or other, and were only waiting for General Tom Harris, who was expected to arrive at any moment. So they tried to persuade us to wait a little while, but the majority of us said no, we were accustomed to falling back, and didn't need any of Tom Harris's help. We could get along perfectly well without him, and save time, too. So about half of our 15, including myself, mounted and left on the instant. The others yielded to persuasion and stayed through the war. An hour later we met General Harris on the road with 2 or 3 people in his company, his staff probably, but we could not tell. None of them was in uniform. Uniforms had not come into vogue among us yet. Harris ordered us back, but we told him there was a Union colonel coming with a whole regiment in his wake, and it looked as if there was going to be a disturbance, so we had concluded to go home. He raged a little, but it was of no use. Our minds were made up. We had done our share, had killed 1 man, exterminated 1 army, such as it was. Let him go and kill the rest, and that would end the war. I did not see that brisk young general again until last year, and then he was wearing white hair and whiskers. In time I came to know that Union colonel whose coming frightened me out of the war and crippled the Southern cause to that extent, General Grant. I came within a few hours of seeing him when he was as unknown as I was myself, at a time when anybody could have said, "Grant? Ulysses S. Grant? I do not remember hearing the name before." It seems difficult to realize that there was once a time when such a remark could be rationally made, but there was, and I was within a few miles of the place, and the occasion too, though proceeding in the other direction. The thoughtful will not throw this war paper of mine lightly aside as being valueless. It has this value. It is a not unfair picture of what went on in many and many a militia camp in the first months of the rebellion, when the green recruits were without discipline, without the steadying and heartening influence or trained leaders, when all their circumstances were new and strange and charged with exaggerated terrors, and before the invaluable experience of actual collision in the field had turned them from rabbits into soldiers. If this side of the picture of that early day has not before been put into history, then history has been to that degree incomplete, for it had and has its rightful place there. There was more Bull Run material scattered through the early camps of this country than exhibited itself at Bull Run, and yet it learned its trade presently, and helped to fight the great battles later. I could have become a soldier myself if I had waited. I had got part of it learned. I knew more about retreating than the man that invented retreating. End of my military campaign. And end of segment 31 of The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg and Other Stories by Mark Twain. This is Meisterschaft. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg and Other Stories by Mark Twain. Segment 32, Meisterschaft, in 3 acts. Note 1. Explanatory. I regard the idea of this play as a valuable invention. I call it the Patent Universally Applicable Automatically Adjustable Language Drama. This indicates that it is adjustable to any tongue, and performable in any tongue. The English portions of the play are to remain just as they are permanently, but you change the foreign portions to any language you please at will. Do you see? You at once have the same old play in a new tongue, and you can keep changing it from language to language until your private theatrical pupils have become glib and at home in the speech of all nations. Zum Beispiel. Suppose we wish to adjust the play to the French tongue. First we give Mrs. Blumenthal and Gretchen French names. Next we knock the German Meisterschaft sentences out of the first scene and replace them with sentences from the French Meisterschaft. Like this, for instance. Je voudrais faire des emplettes ce matin. Voulez-vous avoir l'obligeance de venir avec moi chez les tailleurs français? And so on. Wherever you find German, replace it with French, leaving the English parts undisturbed. When you come to the long conversation in the second act, turn to any pamphlet of your French Meisterschaft and shovel in as much French talk on any subject as will fill up the gaps left by the expunged German. Example, page 423, French Meisterschaft. On dirait qu'il va faire chaud. J'ai extrêmement chaud. Ah, qu'il fait chaud. Il fait une chaleur étouffante. L'air est brûlant. Je meurs de chaleur. Il est presque impossible de supporter la chaleur. Cela vous fait transpirer. Mettons-nous à l'ombre. Il fait du vent. Il fait un vent froid. Il fait un très agréable pour se promener aujourd'hui, and so on all the way through. And it is very easy to adjust the play to any desired language. Anybody can do it. End of note 1. Dramatis Personae. Mr. Stevenson, George Franklin, William Jackson, Gretchen Kellnerin, Margaret Stevenson, Annie Stevenson, Mrs. Blumenthal, the Werthen. Act 1, Scene 1. Scene of the play, the parlor of a small private dwelling in a village. Margaret, discovered crocheting, has a pamphlet. Margaret, solus. Dear, dear, it's dreary enough to have to study this impossible German tongue, to be exiled from home and all human society except a body's sister in order to do it, is just simply
abscheulich.
Here's only 3 weeks of the 3 months gone, and it seems like 3 years. I don't believe I can live through it, and I'm sure Annie can't. Refers to her book and rattles through several times like one memorizing.
Entschuldigen Sie, mein Herr, können Sie mir vielleicht sagen, um wie viel Uhr der erste Zug nach Dresden abgeht?
makes mistakes, and corrects them.
I just hate Meisterschaft. We may see people, we can have society, yes, on condition that the conversation shall be in German, and in German only, every single word of it. Very kind, oh, very, when neither Annie nor I can put two words together, except as they are put together for us in Meisterschaft or that idiotic Ollendorf, refers to book and memorizes.
Mein Bruder hat ihren Herrn Vater nicht gesehen, als gestern in dem Laden des deutschen Kaufmannes war.
Yes, we can have society, provided we talk German. What would conversation be like? If you should stick to Meisterschaft, it would change the subject every 2 minutes, and if you stuck to Ollendorf, it would be all about your sister's mother's good stocking of thread, or your grandfather's aunt's good hammer of the carpenter, and who's got it, and there an end. You couldn't keep up your interest in such topics.
Memorizing.
Wenn irgend möglich, möchte ich noch heute Vormittag Geschäftsfreunde zu treffen.
My mind is made up to one thing. I will be an exile, in spirit and in truth. I will see no one during these 3 months. Father is very ingenious, oh, very, thinks he is anyway, thinks he has invented a way to force us to learn to speak German. He is a dear good soul and all that, but invention isn't his fach. He will see, with eloquent energy. Why, nothing in the world shall...
Bitte, können Sie mir vielleicht sagen, ob Herr Schmidt mit diesem Zuge angekommen ist?
Oh, dear, dear George, 3 weeks. It seems a whole century since I saw him. I wonder if he suspects that I care for him, just a wee bit? I believe he does, and I believe Will suspects that Annie cares for him a little, that I do, and I know perfectly well that they care for us. They agree with all our opinions, no matter what they are, and if they have a prejudice, they change it as soon as they see how foolish it is. Dear George, at first he just couldn't abide cats, but now, why, now he's just all for cats. He fairly welters in cats. I never saw such a reform. And it's just so with all his principles. He hasn't got one that he had before. Ah, if all men were like him, this world would... Memorizing.
Im Gegenteil, mein Herr. Dieser Stoff ist sehr billig. Bitte, sehen Sie sich nur die Qualität an.
Yes, and what did they go to studying German for if it wasn't an inspiration of the highest and purest sympathy? Any other explanation is nonsense. Why, they'd as soon have thought of studying American history. Turns her back, buries herself in her pamphlet, first memorizing aloud until Annie enters, then to herself, rocking to and fro, and rapidly moving her lips without uttering a sound. Enter Annie, absorbed in her pamphlet, does not at first see Margaret. Annie, memorizing.
Ließ mich gestern früh rufen und sagte mir, dass einen sehr unangenehmen Brief von Ihrem Lehrer erhalten hatte.
Repeats twice aloud, then to herself, briskly moving her lips. Margaret, still not seeing her sister.
Wie geht es Ihrem Herrn Schwiegervater? Es freut mich sehr, dass Ihre Frau Mutter wieder wohl ist.
Repeats, then mouths in silence. Annie repeats her sentence a couple of times aloud, then looks up, working her lips, and discovers Margaret.
Oh, you here?
Running to her.
Oh, lovey-dovey, dovey-lovey, I've got the greatest news. Guess, guess, guess. You'll never guess in 100,000 million years and more. Margaret. Oh, tell me, dearie. Don't keep me in agony.
Annie.
Well, I will. What do you think? They're here.
Margaret.
What? Who? When? Which? Speak.
Annie.
Will and George.
Margaret.
Annie Alexandra Victoria Stevenson, what do you mean?
Annie.
As sure as guns.
Margaret, spasmodically embracing and kissing her.
Shh! Don't use such language. Oh, darling, say it again.
Annie.
As sure as guns.
Margaret.
I don't mean that. Tell me again that...
Annie, springing up and waltzing about the room.
They're here, in this very village, to learn German for 3 months.
Es sollte mich sehr freuen, wenn Sie...
Margaret, joining in the dance.
Oh, it's just too lovely for anything.
Unconsciously memorizing.
Es wäre mir lieb, wenn Sie morgen mit mir in die Kirche gehen könnten. Aber ich kann selbst nicht gehen, weil ich sonntags gewöhnlich krank bin. Juche.
Annie, finishing some unconscious memorizing.
Morgen Mittag bei mir speisen könnten. Juche.
Sit down, and I'll tell you all I've heard. They sit. They're here, and under that same odious law that fetters us, our tongues, I mean. The metaphor's faulty, but no matter. They can go out and see people only on condition that they hear and speak German, and German only. Margaret. Isn't that too lovely? Annie. And they're coming to see us. Margaret. Darling, kissing her. But are you sure? Annie. Sure as guns, Gatling guns. Margaret. Shh, don't, child. It's
Schrecklich.
Darling, you aren't mistaken? As sure as batteries. They jump up and dance a moment. Then Margaret, with distress. But Annie, dear, we can't talk German, and neither can they. Annie, sorrowfully. I didn't think of that. Margaret. How cruel it is. What can we do? Annie, after a reflective pause, resolutely. Margaret, we've got to. Margaret. Got to what? Annie. Speak German. Margaret. Why, how, child? Annie, contemplating her pamphlet with earnestness. I can tell you one thing. Just give me the blessed privilege. Just hinsetzen. Will Jackson here in front of me, and I'll talk German to him as long as this Meisterschaft holds out to burn. Margaret joyously. Oh, what an elegant idea! You certainly have got a mind that's a mine of resources, if ever anybody had one. Annie. I'll skin this Meisterschaft to the last sentence in it. Margaret, with a happy idea. Why, Annie, it's the greatest thing in the world. I've been all this time struggling and despairing over these few little Meisterschaft primers. But as sure as you live, I'll have the whole 15 by heart before this time day after tomorrow. See if I don't. Annie. And so will I. And I'll trowel in a layer of Ollendorf mush between every couple of courses of Meisterschaft bricks.
Juche.
Margaret.
Hoch, hoch, hoch.
Annie.
Stoß an.
Margaret.
Juche, wir werden gleich gute deutsche Schülerinnen werden. Juch.
Annie.
He.
Margaret. Annie, when are they coming to see us? Tonight? Annie. No. Margaret. No? Why not? When are they coming? What are they waiting for? The idea! I never heard of such a thing. What do you— Annie, breaking in. Wait, wait, wait. Give a body a chance. They have their reasons. Margaret. Reasons? What reasons? Annie. Well, now, when you stop and think, they're royal good ones. They've got to talk German when they come, haven't they? Of course. Well, they don't know any German, but—
Wie befinden Sie sich?
And—
Haben Sie gut geschlafen?
And—
Vater unser.
And—
Ich trinke lieber Bier als Wasser.
And a few little parlor things like that. But when it comes to talking, why, they don't know 115 German words, put them all together. Margaret. Oh, I see. Annie. So, they're going to neither eat, sleep, smoke, nor speak the truth till they've crammed home the whole 15 Meisterschafts auswendig. Margaret. Noble hearts. Annie. They've given themselves till day after tomorrow, 7:30 p.m., and then they'll arrive here loaded. Margaret. Oh, how lovely, how gorgeous, how beautiful! Some think this world is made of mud. I think it's made of rainbows. Memorizing.
Wenn irgend möglich, so möchte ich noch heute Vormittag dort ankommen, da es mir sehr daran gelegen ist.
Annie, I can learn it just like nothing. Annie. So can I. Meisterschaft's mere fun. I don't see how it ever could have seemed difficult. Come, we can't be disturbed here. Let's give orders that we don't want anything to eat for 2 days, and are absent to friends, dead to strangers, and not at home even to nougat peddlers. Margaret. Schön. And we'll lock ourselves into our rooms, and at the end of 2 days whosoever may ask us a Meisterschaft question shall get a Meisterschaft answer, and hot from the bat. Both, reciting in unison.
Ich habe einen Hut für meinen Sohn, ein paar Handschuhe für meinen Bruder und einen Kamm für mich selbst gekauft.
Exeunt. Enter Mrs. Blumenthal, the Wirthin. Wirthin, solus.
Ach, die armen Mädchen. Sie hassen die deutsche Sprache. Drum ist es ganz und gar unmöglich, dass sie je lernen können. Es bricht mir ja mein Herz, ihre Kummer über die Studien anzusehen. Warum haben Sie den Entschluss gefasst, in Ihren Zimmern ein paar Tage zu bleiben? Ja, gewiss, das versteht sich. Sie sind entmutigt. Arme Kinder.
A knock at the door.
Herein.
Enter Gretchen with card. Gretchen
Er ist schon wieder da und sagt, dass er nur Sie sehen will.
hands the card.
Auch.
Berthen
Gott im Himmel, der Vater der Mädchen?
puts the card in her pocket.
Er wünscht, die Tochter nicht zu treffen? Ganz recht. Also, du schweigst.
Gretchen.
Zu Befehl.
Berthen.
Lass ihn hereinkommen.
Gretchen.
Ja, Frau Wirtin.
Exit Gretchen. Berthen, solus.
Ah, jetzt muss ich ihm die Wahrheit offenbaren.
Enter Mr. Stevenson. Stevenson.
Good morning, Mrs. Blumenthal. Keep your seat, please. I'm only here for a moment. Merely to get your report, you know.
Seating himself.
Don't want to see the girls, poor things. They'd want to go home with me. I'm afraid I couldn't have the heart to say no. How's the German getting along?
Berthen.
Not very well. I was afraid you would ask me that. You see, they hate it. They don't take the least interest in it, and there isn't anything to incite them to an interest, you see, and so they can't talk at all.
Stevenson.
That's bad. I had an idea that they'd get lonesome and have to seek society. And then, of course, my plan would work, considering the cast-iron conditions of it.
Worthen. But it hasn't, so far. I've thrown nice company in their way. I've done my very best in every way I could think of, but it's no use. They won't go out, they won't receive anybody, and a body can't blame them. They'd be tongue-tied, couldn't do anything with a German conversation. Now, when I started to learn German, such poor German as I know, the case was very different. My intended was a German. I was to live among Germans the rest of my life, and so I had to learn. Why, bless my heart, I nearly lost the man the first time he asked me. I thought he was talking about the measles. They were very prevalent at the time. Told him I didn't want any in mine. But I found out the mistake, and I was fixed for him next time. Oh, yes, Mr. Stevenson, a sweetheart's a prime incentive.
Stevenson, aside. Good soul, she doesn't suspect that my plan is a double scheme, includes a speaking knowledge of German, which I am bound they shall have, and the keeping them away from those two young fellows, though if I had known that those boys were going off for a year's foreign travel, However, the girls would never learn that language at home. They're here, and I won't relent. They've got to stick the 3 months out. Aloud.
So they are making poor progress. Now tell me, will they learn it, after a sort of fashion, I mean, in 3 months?
Worthen.
Well, now I'll tell you the only chance I see. Do what I will, they won't answer my German with anything but English. If that goes on, they'll stand stock still. Now, I'm willing to do this. I'll straighten everything up, get matters in smooth running order, and day after tomorrow I'll go to bed sick, and stay sick 3 weeks.
Stevenson.
Good. You are an angel. I see your idea. The servant girl, Worthen. That's it. That's my project. She doesn't know a word of English, and Gretchen's a real good soul, and can talk the slates off a roof. Her tongue's just a flutter-mill. I'll keep my room, just ailing a little, and they'll never see my face except when they pay their little duty visits to me. And then I'll say English disorders my mind. They'll be shut up with Gretchen's windmill, and she'll just grind them to powder. Oh, they'll get a start in the language, sort of a one, sure as you live. You come back in 3 weeks.
Stevenson. Bless you, my
Retterin.
I'll be here to the day. Get ye to your sick room, you shall have treble pay.
looking at watch.
Good. I can just catch my train.
Leben Sie wohl.
Exit. Werthen.
Leben Sie wohl, mein Herr.
End of Act 1 of Meisterschaft, and end of Section 32 of The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg and Other Stories by Mark Twain. This is Meisterschaft, Act 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg and Other Stories by Mark Twain. Segment 33, Meisterschaft, Act 2. Scene 1. Time, a couple of days later. The girls discovered with their work and primers. Annie.
Was fehlt der Wirtin?
Margaret.
Das weiß ich nicht. Sie ist schon vor 2 Tagen ins Bett gegangen.
Annie.
My, how fließend you speak.
Margaret.
Dankeschön. Und sagte, dass sie nicht wohl sei.
Annie.
Good? Oh, no, I don't mean that. No, only lucky for us.
Glücklich.
You know, I mean, because it'll be so much nicer to have them all to ourselves.
Margaret.
Oh, natürlich. Ja, das ziehe ich durchaus vor.
Do you believe your Meisterschaft will stay with you, Annie?
Annie.
Well, I know it is with me, every last sentence of it, and a couple of hods of Ollendorf, too, for emergencies. Maybe they'll refuse to deliver right off at first, you know.
Der Verlegenheit wegen. Aber ich will sie später herausholen.
When I get my hand in.
Und vergisst du das nicht.
Margaret.
Sei nicht grob, Liebste.
What shall we talk about first, when they come?
Annie.
Well, let me see. There's shopping, and all that about the trains, you know, and going to church, and buying tickets to London and Berlin and all around, and all that subjunctive stuff about the battle in Afghanistan and where the American was said to be born and so on, and there's so many things. I don't think a body can choose beforehand because, you know, the circumstances and the atmosphere always have so much to do in directing a conversation, especially a German conversation, which is only a kind of insurrection anyway. I believe it's best to just depend on glancing at watch and gasping, 7:30.
Margaret.
Oh, dear, I'm all of a tremble. Let's get something ready, Annie.
Both fall nervously to reciting.
Entschuldigen Sie, mein Herr, könnten Sie mir vielleicht sagen, wie ich nach dem norddeutschen Bahnhof gehe?
They repeat it several times, losing their grip and mixing it all up. Both.
Herein. Oh dear. Oh, der Heilige.
Enter Gretchen. Gretchen, ruffled and indignant.
Entschuldigen Sie, meine gnädigsten Fräulein, es sind 2 junge, rasende Herren draußen. Aber ich habe Ihnen geschworen, dass...
Handing the cards. Margaret.
Du liebe Zeit.
They're here. And of course, down goes my back hair. Stay and receive them, dear, while leaving.
Annie.
I alone? I won't. I'll go with you.
To Gretchen.
Lassen Sie die Herren näher treten und sagen Sie ihnen, dass wir gleich zurückkommen werden.
Exit. Gretchen, solus.
Was? Sie freuen sich darüber? Und ich sollte wirklich diese Blödsinnigen, dies grobe Rindvieh hereinlassen? In den hilflosen Umständen meiner gnädigen jungen Damen? Unsinn.
Pause, thinking.
Wohlan, ich werde sie mal beschützen. Sollte man nicht glauben, dass sie einen Sparren zu viel hatten?
Tapping her skull significantly.
Was sie mir doch alles gesagt haben. Der eine, guten Morgen, wie geht es Ihrem Herrn Schwiegervater? Du liebe Zeit, wie sollte ich einen Schwiegervater haben können? Und der andere, es tut mir sehr leid, dass Ihr Herr Vater meinen Bruder nicht gesehen hat, als er doch gestern in dem Laden des deutschen Kaufmannes war. Potztausend Himmelsdonnerwetter! Oh, ich war ganz rasend. Wie ich aber rief, meine Herren, ich kenne Sie nicht, und Sie kennen meinen Vater nicht. Wissen Sie, denn er ist schon lange durchgebrannt und geht nicht beim Tage in einen Laden hinein, wissen Sie, und ich habe keinen Schwiegervater. Gott sei Dank werde ich auch nie einen kriegen, werde überhaupt, wissen Sie, ein solches Ding nie haben, nie dulden, nie ausstehen. Warum greifen Sie ein Mädchen an, das nur Unschuld kennt, das Ihnen nie etwas zuleide getan hat? Dann haben sie sich beide die Finger in die Ohren gesteckt und gebetet. Allmächtiger Gott, erbarme dich unser.
Pauses.
Nun, ich werde schon diesen Schurken Einlass gönnen, aber ich werde ein Auge mit ihnen haben, damit sie sich nicht wie reine Teufel gebärden sollen.
Exit, grumbling and shaking her head. Enter William and George. William.
My land, what a girl! And what an incredible gift of gabble! Kind of patent climate-proof compensation balance self-acting automatic Meisterschaft. Touch her button and brrr, away she goes.
George.
Never heard anything like it. Tongue journaled on ball bearings. I wonder what she said. Seemed to be swearing mainly.
William.
after mumbling Meisterschaft a while. "Look here, George, this is awful. Come to think, this project, we can't talk this frantic language." George: "I know it, Will, and it is awful, but I can't live without seeing Margaret. I've endured it as long as I can. I should die if I tried to hold out longer, and even German is preferable to death." William, hesitatingly: "Well, I don't know. It's a matter of opinion." George, irritably: "It isn't a matter of opinion, either. German is preferable to death." William, reflectively: "Well, I don't know. The problem is so sudden. But I think you may be right. Some kinds of death. It is more than likely that a slow, lingering— Well, now, there in Canada, in the early times, a couple of centuries ago, the Indians would take a missionary and skin him, and get some hot ashes and boiling water and one thing and another, and by that missionary— Well, yes, I can see that, by and by, talking German could be a pleasant change for him." George: "Why, of course.
Das versteht sich.
But you have to always think a thing out, or you're not satisfied. But let's not go to bothering about thinking out this present business. We're here, we're in for it. You are as moribund to see Annie as I am to see Margaret. You know the terms. We've got to speak German. Now stop your mooning and get at your Meisterschaft. We've got nothing else in the world." William: "Do you think that'll see us through?" George: "Why, it's got to. Suppose we wandered out of it and took a chance at the language on our own responsibility. Where the nation would we be? Up a stump, that's where. Our only safety is in sticking like wax to the text." William: "But what can we talk about?" George: "Why, anything that Meisterschaft talks about. It ain't our affair." William: "I know, but Meisterschaft talks about everything." George: "And yet don't talk about anything long enough for it to get embarrassing. Meisterschaft is just splendid for general conversation." William: "Yes, that's so, but it's so blamed general. Won't it sound foolish?" George: "Foolish? Why, of course, all German sounds foolish." William: "Well, that is true. I didn't think of that." George: "Now don't fool around any more. Load up, get ready. Fix up some sentences. You'll need them in 2 minutes, new." They walk up and down, moving their lips in dumb show memorizing. William: "Look here, when we've said all that's in the book on a topic, and want to change the subject, how can we say so? How would a German say it?" George: "Well, I don't know. But you know when they mean change cars, they say—
Umsteigen.
Don't you reckon that will answer?" William: "Tip-top. It's short and goes right to the point, and it's got a business wang to it that's almost American."
Umsteigen.
"Change subject. Why, it's the very thing." George: "All right, then. You—"
Umsteigen.
"For I hear them coming." Enter the girls. Annie to William with solemnity:
Guten Morgen, mein Herr. Es freut mich sehr, Sie zu sehen.
William:
Guten Morgen, mein Fräulein. Es freut mich sehr, Sie zu sehen.
Margaret and George repeat the same sentences. Then, after an embarrassing silence, Margaret refers to her book and says: Margaret:
Bitte, meine Herren, setzen Sie sich.
The gentlemen:
Danke schön.
The four seat themselves in couples, the width of the stage apart, and the two conversations begin. The talk is not flowing, at any rate at first. There are painful silences all along. Each couple worry out a remark and a reply. There is a pause of silent thinking, and then the other couple deliver themselves. William:
Haben Sie meinen Vater in dem Laden meines Bruders nicht gesehen?
Annie:
Nein, mein Herr, ich habe Ihren Herrn Vater in dem Laden Ihres Herrn Bruders nicht gesehen.
George:
Waren Sie gestern Abend im Konzert oder im Theater?
Margaret:
Nein, ich war gestern Abend nicht im Konzert, noch im Theater. Ich war gestern Abend zu Hause.
General breakdown, long pause. William:
Ich störe doch nicht etwa.
Annie:
Sie stören mich durchaus nicht.
George:
Bitte, lassen Sie sich nicht von mir stören.
Margaret:
Aber ich bitte Sie, Sie stören mich durchaus nicht.
William to both girls:
Wenn wir Sie stören, so gehen wir gleich wieder.
Annie:
Oh nein, gewiss nein.
Margaret:
Im Gegenteil, es freut uns sehr, Sie zu sehen. Alle beide.
William:
Schön.
George:
Gott sei Dank.
Margaret aside: It's just lovely. Annie aside: It's like a poem. Pause.
William.
Umsteigen.
Margaret.
Welches?
William.
Steigen.
George.
Auf Englisch change cars. Oder Subject.
Both girls.
Wie schön.
William.
Wir haben uns die Freiheit genommen, bei Ihnen vorzusprechen.
Annie.
Sie sind sehr gütig.
George.
Wir wollten uns erkundigen, wie Sie sich befanden.
Margaret.
Ich bin Ihnen sehr verbunden, meine Schwester auch.
William.
Meine Frau lässt sich Ihnen bestens empfehlen.
Annie.
Ihre Frau?
William, examining his book,
Vielleicht habe ich mich geirrt.
shows the place.
Nein, gerade so sagt das Buch.
Annie, satisfied.
Ganz recht. Aber
William.
bitte empfehlen Sie mich Ihrem Herrn Bruder.
Annie,
Ah, das ist viel besser, viel besser.
aside.
Wenigstens, es wäre viel besser, wenn ich einen Bruder hätte.
George.
Wie ist es Ihnen ergangen, seitdem ich das Vergnügen hatte, Sie anderswo zu sehen?
Margaret.
Danke bestens. Ich befinde mich gewöhnlich ziemlich wohl.
Gretchen slips in with a gun and listens. George, still to Margaret.
Befindet sich Ihre Frau Gemahlin wohl?
Gretchen, raising hands and eyes,
Frau Gemahlin, heiliger Gott!
is like to betray herself with her smothered laughter and glides out. Margaret.
Danke sehr, meine Frau ist ganz wohl.
Pause. William.
Dürfen wir vielleicht umsteigen?
The others. Gut. George, aside.
I feel better now. I'm beginning to catch on.
Aloud.
Ich möchte gern morgen früh einige Einkäufe machen und würde Ihnen sehr verbunden sein, wenn Sie mir den Gefallen täten, mir die Namen der besten hiesigen Firmen aufzuschreiben.
Margaret, aside.
How sweet.
William, aside.
Hang it. I was going to say that. That's one of the noblest things in the book.
Annie.
Ich möchte Ihnen gern begleiten, aber es ist mir wirklich heute Morgen ganz unmöglich auszugehen.
Aside.
It's getting as easy as 9 times 7 is 46.
Margaret.
Sagen Sie dem Briefträger, wenn's gefällig ist, er möchte Ihnen den eingeschriebenen Brief geben lassen.
William.
Ich würde Ihnen sehr verbunden sein, wenn Sie diese Schachtel für mich nach der Post tragen würden, da mir sehr daran liegt, einen meiner Geschäftsfreunde in dem Laden des deutschen Kaufmanns heute Abend treffen zu können.
Aside.
All down but 9. Set 'em up on the other alley.
Annie.
Aber, Herr Jackson, Sie haben die Sätze gemischt. Es ist unbegreiflich, wie Sie das haben tun können. Zwischen Ihrem ersten Teil und Ihrem letzten Teil haben Sie ganz 50 Seiten übergeschlagen. Jetzt bin ich ganz verloren. Wie kann man reden, wenn man seinen Platz durchaus nicht wiederfinden kann?
William.
Oh bitte, verzeihen Sie. Ich habe das wirklich nicht beabsichtigt.
Annie, mollified.
Sehr wohl. Lassen Sie es gut sein. Aber tun Sie es nicht wieder. Sie müssen ja doch einräumen, dass solche Dinge unerträgliche Verwirrung mit sich führen.
Gretchen slips in again with her gun. William.
Unzweifelhaft haben Sie recht, meine holdselige Landsmännin. Umsteigen.
As George gets fairly into the following, Gretchen draws a bead on him and lets drive at the close, but the gun snaps. George.
Glauben Sie, dass ich ein hübsches Wohnzimmer für mich selbst und ein kleines Schlafzimmer für meinen Sohn in diesem Hotel für 15 Mark die Woche bekommen kann? Oder würden Sie mir raten, in einer Privatwohnung Logis zu nehmen?
Aside. That's a daisy. Gretchen, aside.
Schade.
She draws her charge and reloads. Margaret.
Glauben Sie nicht, Sie werden besser tun, bei diesem Wetter zu Hause zu bleiben?
Annie.
Freilich glaube ich, Herr Franklin, Sie werden sich erkälten, wenn Sie bei diesem unbeständigen Wetter ohne Überrock ausgehen.
Gretchen, relieved, aside.
So, man redet von Ausgehen. Das klingt schon besser.
Sits. William, to Annie,
Wie teuer haben Sie das gekauft?
indicating a part of her dress. Annie.
Das hat 18 Mark gekostet.
William.
Das ist sehr teuer.
George.
Ja, obgleich dieser Stoff wunderschön ist und das Muster sehr geschmackvoll und auch das vorzüglichste, das es in dieser Art gibt, so ist es doch furchtbar teuer für einen solchen Artikel.
Margaret, aside.
How sweet is this communion of soul with soul.
Annie.
Im Gegenteil, mein Herr, das ist sehr billig. Sehen Sie sich nur die Qualität an.
They all examine it. George.
Möglicherweise ist es das Allerneueste, das man in diesem Stoff hat. Aber das Muster gefällt mir nicht.
Pause. William.
Umsteigen.
Annie.
Welchen Hund haben Sie? Haben Sie den hübschen Hund des Kaufmanns oder den hässlichen Hund der Urgroßmutter des Lehrlings des bogenbeinigen Zimmermanns?
William, aside. Oh, come, she's ringing in a cold deck on us. That's Ollendorf. George,
Ich habe nicht den Hund des...
aside, stuck. That's no Meisterschaft. They don't play fair. Aloud.
Ich habe nicht den Hund des... In unserem Buche leider gibt es keinen Hund. Daher, ob ich auch gern von solchen Tieren sprechen möchte, ist es mir doch unmöglich, weil ich nicht vorbereitet bin. Entschuldigen Sie, meine Damen.
Gretchen, aside.
Beim Teufel, Sie sind alle blödsinnig geworden. In meinem Leben habe ich nie ein so narrisches, verfluchtes, verdammtes Gespräch gehört.
William.
Bitte, umsteigen.
Run the following rapidly through. Margaret, aside.
Oh, I've flushed an easy batch.
Aloud.
Würden Sie mir erlauben, meine Reisetasche hier hinzustellen?
Gretchen, aside.
Wo ist seine Reisetasche? Ich sehe keine.
William.
Bitte sehr.
George.
Ist meine Reisetasche Ihnen im Wege?
Gretchen, aside.
Und wo ist seine Reisetasche?
Annie.
Erlauben Sie mir, Sie von meiner Reisetasche zu befreien?
Gretchen, aside.
Du Esel.
William.
Ganz und gar nicht.
To George.
Es ist sehr schwül in diesem Coupé.
Gretchen, aside.
Coupé.
George.
Sie haben recht. Erlauben Sie mir gefälligst, das Fenster zu öffnen. Ein wenig Luft würde uns gut tun.
Margaret.
Wir fahren sehr rasch.
Annie.
Haben Sie den Namen jener Station gehört?
William.
Wie lange halten wir auf dieser Station an?
George.
Ich reise nach Dresden. Schaffner, wo muss ich umsteigen?
Gretchen, aside.
Sie sind ja alle ganz und gar verrückt. Man denke sich, Sie glauben, dass Sie auf der Eisenbahn reisen.
George, aside to William. Now brace up. Pull all your confidence together, my boy, and we'll try that lovely goodbye business a flutter. I think it's about the gaudiest thing in the book. If you boom it right along and don't get left on a base, it'll impress the girls. Aloud.
Lassen Sie uns gehen. Es ist schon sehr spät und ich muss morgen ganz früh aufstehen.
Gretchen, aside, grateful.
Gott sei Dank, dass Sie endlich gehen.
Sets her gun aside. William to George.
Ich danke Ihnen höflichst für die Ehre, die Sie mir erweisen, aber ich kann nicht länger bleiben.
George to William.
Entschuldigen Sie mich gütigst, aber ich kann wirklich nicht länger bleiben.
Gretchen looks on stupefied. William to George.
Ich habe schon eine Einladung angenommen. Ich kann wirklich nicht länger bleiben.
Gretchen fingers her gun again. George to William.
Ich muss gehen.
William to George.
Wie? Sie wollen schon wieder gehen? Sie sind ja eben erst gekommen.
Margaret aside. It's just music. Annie aside.
Oh, how lovely they do it.
George to William.
Also denken Sie doch noch nicht ans Gehen.
William to George.
Es tut mir unendlich leid, aber ich muss nach Hause. Meine Frau wird sich wundern, was aus mir geworden ist.
George to William.
Meine Frau hat keine Ahnung, wo ich bin. Ich muss wirklich jetzt fort.
William to George.
Dann will ich Sie nicht länger aufhalten. Ich bedauere sehr, dass Sie uns einen so kurzen Besuch gemacht haben.
George to William.
Adieu. Auf recht baldiges Wiedersehen.
William.
Umsteigen.
Great hand clapping from the girls. Margaret aside.
Oh, how perfect, how elegant.
Annie aside.
Perfectly enchanting.
Joyous chorus. All.
Ich habe gehabt, du hast gehabt, er hat gehabt, wir haben gehabt, ihr habet gehabt, sie haben gehabt.
Gretchen faints and tumbles from her chair, and the gun goes off with a crash. Each girl, frightened, seizes the protecting hand of her sweetheart. Gretchen scrambles up. Tableau. William takes out some money, beckons Gretchen to him. George adds money to the pile,
Hübsches Mädchen,
giving her some of the coins.
hast du etwas gesehen?
Gretchen, courtesy, aside.
Der Engel.
Aloud, impressively.
Ich habe nichts gesehen.
William, more money.
Hast du etwas gehört?
Gretchen.
Ich habe nichts gehört.
William, more money.
Und morgen?
Gretchen.
Morgen? Wäre es nötig, bin ich taub und blind.
William,
Unvergleichbares Mädchen. Und
giving the rest of the money.
danach?
Gretchen, deep courtesy, aside.
Erzengel.
Aloud.
Danach, mein Gnädigster, betrachten Sie mich also taub, blind, tot.
All in chorus with reverent joy.
Ich habe gehabt, du hast gehabt, er hat gehabt, wir haben gehabt, ihr habet gehabt, sie haben gehabt.
End of Act 2 of Meisterschaft, and end of Segment 33 of The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg and Other Stories by Mark Twain. This is Act 3 of Meisterschaft. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg and Other Stories by Mark Twain. Segment 34, Meisterschaft, Act 3. 3 weeks later, Scene 1. Enter Gretchen, and puts her shawl on a chair, brushing around with the traditional feather duster of the drama, smartly dressed, for she is prosperous. Gretchen.
Wie hatte man sich das vorstellen können? In nur 3 Wochen bin ich schon reich geworden.
Gets out of her pocket handful after handful of silver, which she piles on the table, and proceeds to repile and count, occasionally ringing or biting a piece to try its quality.
Oh, dass
With a sigh.
die Frau Wirtin nur ewig krank bliebe. Diese edlen jungen Männer, sie sind ja so liebenswürdig und so fleißig und so treu. Jeden Morgen kommen sie gerade um 8:45 und plaudern und schwatzen und plappern und schnattern. Die jungen Damen auch. Um Schlage 12 nehmen sie Abschied. Um Schlage 1 kommen sie schon wieder und plaudern und schwatzen und plappern und schnattern. Gerade um 6 Uhr nehmen sie wiederum Abschied. Um 7:30 kehren sie noch einmal zurück und plaudern und schwatzen und plappern und schnattern bis 10 Uhr oder vielleicht ein Viertel nach, falls ihre Uhren nachgehen. Und stets gehen sie nach am Ende des Besuchs, aber stets vor Beginn desselben. Und zuweilen unterhalten sich die jungen Leute beim Spazierengehen. Und jeden Sonntag gehen sie 3-mal in die Kirche. Und immer plaudern sie und schwatzen und plappern und schnattern, bis ihnen die Zähne aus dem Mund fallen. Und ich? Durch Mangel an Übung ist mir die Zunge mit Moos belegt worden. Freilich ist's mir eine dumme Zeit gewesen. Aber, um Gottes Willen, was geht das mir an? Was soll ich daraus machen? Täglich sagt die Frau Wirtin: Gretchen,
Dumb show of paying a piece of money into her hand.
du bist eine der besten Sprachlehrerinnen der Welt. Ach Gott, und täglich sagen die edlen jungen Männer: Gretchen, liebes Kind,
Money paying again in dumb show 3 coins.
bleib taub, blind, tot. Und so bleibe ich. Jetzt wird es ungefähr 9 Uhr sein. Bald kommen sie vom Spazierengehen zurück. Also, es wäre gut, dass ich meinem eigenen Schatz einen Besuch abstatte und spazieren gehe.
Dons her shawl. Exit left. Enter Worthen, right. Worthen. That was Mr. Stevenson's train that just came in. Evidently the girls are out walking with Gretchen. Can't find them, and she doesn't seem to be around. A ring at the door. That's him. I'll go see. Exit right. Enter Stevenson and Worthen, right. Stevenson. Well, how does sickness seem to agree with you? Worthen. So well that I've never been out of my room since, till I heard your train come in. Stevenson. Thou miracle of fidelity! Now I argue from that the new plan is working. Worthen. Working? Mr. Stevenson, you never saw anything like it in the whole course of your life. It's absolutely wonderful the way it works. Stevenson. Succeeds? No, you don't mean it. Worthen. Indeed I do mean it. I tell you, Mr. Stevenson, that plan was just an inspiration. That's what it was. You could teach a cat German by it. Stevenson. Dear me, this is noble news. Tell me about it. Worthen. Well, it's all Gretchen, every bit of it. I told you she was a jewel. And then the sagacity of that child. Why, I never dreamed it was in her. Shh, never you ask the young ladies a question. Never let on. Just keep mum. Leave the whole thing to me. Shh. Stevenson. Good. And she justified, did she? Worthen. Well, sir, the amount of German gabble that child crammed into those 2 girls inside the next 48 hours, well, I was satisfied. So I've never asked a question, never wanted to ask any. I've just lain curled up there, happy. The little dears, they've flitted in to see me a moment every morning and noon and supper time, and as sure as I'm sitting here, inside of 6 days they were clattering German to me like a house afire. Stevenson. Splendid, splendid. Worthen. Of course, it ain't grammatical. The inventor of the language can't talk grammatical. If the dative didn't fetch him, the accusative would, but it's German all the same, and don't you forget it. Stevenson. Go on. This is delicious news. Werthen. Gretchen, she says to me at the start, never you mind about company for 'em. Shh. I'm company enough. And I says, all right, fix it your own way, child. And that she was right is shown by the fact that to this day they don't care a straw for any company but hers. Stevenson. Dear me, why, it's admirable. Werthen. Well, I should think so. They just dote on that hussy, can't seem to get enough of her. Gretchen tells me so herself, and the care she takes of them. She tells me that every time there's a moonlight night she coaxes them out for a walk, and if a body can believe her, she actually bullies them off to church 3 times every Sunday. Stevenson. Why, the little missionary. Really, she's a genius. Werthen. She's a bud, I tell you. Dear me, how she's brought those girls' health up. Cheeks? Just roses. Gait? They walk on watch springs. And happy? By the bliss in their eyes you'd think they're in paradise. Ah, that Gretchen! Just you imagine our trying to achieve these marvels. Stevenson. You're right, every time. Those girls! Why, all they'd have wanted to know was what we wanted done, and then they wouldn't have done it, the mischievous young rascals. Werthen. Don't tell me. Bless you, I found that out early, when I was bossing. Stevenson. Well, I'm immensely pleased. Now fetch them down. I'm not afraid now. They won't want to go home. Werthen. Home! I don't believe you could drag them away from Gretchen with 9 span of horses. But if you want to see them, put on your hat and come along. They're out somewhere traipsing along with Gretchen. Going. Stevenson. I'm with you. Lead on. Werthen. We'll go out the side door. It's towards the Anlage. Exit both. Left. Enter George and Margaret. Right. Her head lies upon his shoulder, his arm is about her waist. They are steeped in sentiment. Margaret, turning a fond face up to him.
Du Engel,
George.
Liebste.
Margaret.
Oh, das Liedchen, das du mir gewidmet hast. Es ist so schön, so wunderschön. Wie hatte ich je geahnt, dass du ein Poet wärest?
George.
Mein Schätzchen, es ist mir lieb, wenn dir die Kleinigkeit gefällt.
Margaret.
Ah, es ist mit der zärtlichsten Musik gefüllt. Klingt ja so süß und selig, wie das Flüstern des Sommerwindes die Abenddämmerung hindurch. Wieder, teuerste, sag es wieder.
George.
Du bist wie eine Blume, so schön und hold und rein. Ich schau dich an, und Wehmut schleicht mir ins Herz hinein. Mir ist, als ob ich die Hände aufs Haupte legen sollt, betend, dass Gott dich erhalte, so rein und schön und hold.
Margaret.
Ach,
Dumb show sentimentalisms.
Georgie.
George.
Kindchen.
Margaret.
Warum kommen Sie nicht?
George.
Das weiß ich gar nicht. Sie waren...
Margaret.
Es wird spät, wir müssen Sie antreiben. Komm.
George.
Ich glaube, Sie werden recht bald ankommen, aber...
Exit both. Left. Enter Gretchen, right, in a state of mind, slumps into a chair limp with despair. Gretchen.
Ach, was wird jetzt aus mir werden? Zufällig habe ich in der Ferne den verdammten Papa gesehen. Und die Frau Wirtin auch. Oh, diese Erscheinung, die hat mir beinahe das Leben genommen. Sie suchen die jungen Damen. Das weiß ich, wenn sie diese und die jungen Herren zusammenfanden. Du heiliger Gott, wenn das geschieht, wären wir alle ganz und gar verloren. Ich muß sie gleich finden und ihr eine Warnung geben.
Exit left. Enter Annie and William, right, posed like the former couple and sentimental. Annie.
Ich liebe dich schon so sehr, deiner edlen Natur wegen, dass du dazu auch ein Dichter bist. Ach, mein Leben ist übermäßig reich geworden. Wer hätte es sich doch einbilden können, dass ich einen Mann zu einem so wunderschönen Gedicht hätte begeistern können?
William.
Liebste, es ist nur eine Kleinigkeit.
Annie.
Nein, nein, es ist ein echtes Wunder. Sage es noch einmal. Ich flehe dich an.
William.
Du bist wie eine Blume, so schön und hold und rein. Ich schau dich an, und Wehmut schleicht mir ins Herz hinein. Mir ist, als ob ich die Hände aufs Haupte legen soll, betend, dass Gott dich erhält, so rein und schön und hold.
Annie.
Ach, es ist himmlisch. Einfach himmlisch.
Kiss.
Schreibt auch George Gedicht?
William.
Oh ja, zuweilen.
Annie.
Wie schön.
William, aside, smooches him, same as I do. It was a noble, good idea to play that little thing on her. George wouldn't ever think of that. Somehow he never had any invention. Annie, arranging chairs.
Jetzt will ich bei dir sitzen bleiben. Und du?
William, they sit.
Ja, und ich?
Annie.
Du wirst mir die alte Geschichte, die immer neu bleibt, noch wieder erzählen.
William.
Zum Beispiel, dass ich dich liebe.
Annie.
Wieder.
William.
Ich. Sie kommen.
Enter George and Margaret. Annie.
Das macht nichts. Fortan.
George unties Margaret's bonnet. She reties his cravat, interspersings of love-pats, etc., and dumb show of love-quarrelings. William.
Ich liebe dich.
Annie.
Ach, noch einmal.
William.
Ich habe dich vom Herzen lieb.
Annie.
Ach, abermals.
William.
Bist du denn noch nicht satt?
Annie.
Nein.
The other couple sit down, and Margaret begins a retying of the cravat. Enter the Worthon and Stevenson, he imposing silence with a sign.
Mich hungert sehr. Ich verhungere.
William.
Oh, du armes Kind.
Lays her head on his shoulder. Dumb show between Stevenson and Worthon.
Und hungert es mich nicht? Du hast mir nicht einmal gesagt,
Annie.
dass ich dich liebe? Mein eigener.
Frau Worthon threatens to faint, is supported by Stevenson.
Höre mich nur an. Ich liebe dich. Ich liebe dich.
Enter Gretchen. Gretchen tears her hair.
Oh, dass ich in der Hölle wäre.
Margaret.
Ich liebe dich. Ich liebe dich. Ach, ich bin so glücklich, dass ich nicht schlafen kann, nicht lesen kann, nicht reden kann, nicht...
Annie.
Und ich bin auch so glücklich, dass ich nicht speisen kann, nicht studieren, arbeiten, denken, schreiben.
Stevenson, to Worthon, aside. Oh, there isn't any mistake about it. Gretchen's just a rattling teacher. Worthon, to Stevenson, aside. I'll skin her alive when I get my hands on her. Margaret.
Komm, alle Verliebte.
They jump up, join hands, and sing in chorus.
Du, wie ich dich liebe. Du liebest auch mich. Die zärtlichsten Triebe.
Stevenson, stepping forward. Well! The girls throw themselves upon his neck with enthusiasm. The girls.
Why, Father!
Stevenson. My darlings! The young men hesitate a moment. Then they add their embrace, flinging themselves on Stevenson's neck, along with the girls. The young men. Why, Father! Stevenson, struggling. Oh, come, this is too thin. Too quick, I mean. Let go, you rascals. George. We'll never let go till you put us on the family list. Margaret.
Right. Hold on to him.
Annie.
Cling to him, Will.
Gretchen rushes in and joins the general embrace, but is snatched away by the Worthon, crushed up against the wall, and threatened with destruction. Stevenson, suffocating. All right, have it your own way, you quartet of swindlers. Worthon.
He's a darling. 3 cheers for Papa.
Everybody, except Stevenson, who bows with hand on heart.
Hip, 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 hooray, hooray, hooray.
Gretchen.
Der Tiger. Ah.
Worthon.
Sei ruhig.
You hussy. Stevenson. Well, I've lost a couple of precious daughters, but I've gained a couple of precious scamps to fill up the gap with. So it's all right. I'm satisfied, and everybody's forgiven. With mock threats at Gretchen. William.
Oh, wir werden für dich sorgen. Du herrliches Gretchen.
Gretchen.
Dankeschön.
Margaret to Worthon.
Und für Sie auch, denn wenn Sie nicht so freundlich gewesen wären, krank zu werden, wie wären wir je so glücklich geworden wie jetzt?
Worthon.
Well, dear, I was kind, but I didn't mean it. But I ain't sorry, not one bit, that I ain't.
Tableau. Stevenson. Come now, the situation is full of hope, and grace, and tender sentiment. If I had in the least poetic gift, I know I could improvise under such an inspiration. Each girl nudges her sweetheart. Something worthy to... Is there no poet among us? Each youth turns solemnly his back upon the other, and raises his hands in benediction over his sweetheart's bowed head. Both youths at once.
Mir ist, als ob ich die Hände aufs Haupt dir legen sollt.
They turn and look reproachfully at each other. The girls contemplate them with injured surprise. Stevenson, reflectively.
I think I've heard that before somewhere.
Burthon, aside.
Why, the very cats in Germany know it.
Curtain. End of Act 3 of Meisterschaft. And end of Segment 34 of The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg and Other Stories by Mark Twain. This is My Boyhood Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg and Other Stories by Mark Twain. Section 35, My Boyhood Dreams.
The dreams of my boyhood? No, they have not been realized. For all who are old, there is something infinitely pathetic about the subject which you have chosen, for in no gray head's case can it suggest any but one thing: disappointment. Disappointment is its own reason for its pain. The quality or dignity of the hope that failed is a matter aside. The dreamer's valuation of the thing lost, not another man's, is the only standard to measure it by, and his grief, for it makes it large and great and fine, and is worthy of our reverence in all cases. We should carefully remember that. There are 1,600 million people in the world. Of these, there is but a trifling number, in fact only 38 millions, who can understand why a person should have an ambition to belong to the French army, and why, belonging to it, he should be proud of that, and why, having got down that far, he should want to go on down till he struck the bottom and got on the general staff, and why, being stripped of this livery, or set free and reinvested with his self-respect by any other quick and thorough process, let it be what it might, he should wish to return to his strange serfage. But no matter. The estimate put upon these things by the 1,560 millions is no proper measure for their value. The proper measure, the just measure, is that which is put upon them by Dreyfus, and is cipherable merely upon the littleness or the vastness of the disappointment which their loss cost him. There you have it. The measure of the magnitude of a dream failure is the measure of the disappointment the failure cost the dreamer. The value, in others' eyes, of the thing lost has nothing to do with the matter. With this straightening out and classification of the dreamer's position to help us, perhaps we can put ourselves in his place and respect his dream, Dreyfus's, and the dreams our friends have cherished and revealed to us. Some that I call to mind, some that have been revealed to me, are curious enough, but we may not smile at them, for they were precious to the dreamers, and their failure has left scars which give them dignity and pathos. With this theme in my mind, dear heads that were brown when they and mine were young together rise old and white before me now, beseeching me to speak for them, and most lovingly will I do it. Howells, Hay, Aldrich, Matthews, Stockton, Cable, Remus, how their young hopes and ambitions come flooding back to my memory now, out of the vague far past, the beautiful past, the lamented past. I remember it so well, that night we met together. It was in Boston, and Mr. Fiends was there, and Mr. Osgood, Ralph Keeler, and Boyle O'Reilly, lost to us now these many years, and under the seal of confidence revealed to each other what our boyhood dreams had been, dreams which had not as yet been blighted, but over which was stealing the gray of the night that was to come, a night which we prophetically felt, and this feeling oppressed us and made us sad. I remember that Howell's voice broke twice, and it was only with great difficulty that he was able to go on. In the end he wept. For he had hoped to be an auctioneer. He told of his early struggles to climb to his goal, and how at last he attained to within a single step of the coveted summit. But there misfortune after misfortune assailed him, and he went down and down and down, until now at last, weary and disheartened, he had for the present given up the struggle, and become the editor of the Atlantic Monthly. This was in 1830. 70 years are gone since, and where now is his dream? It will never be fulfilled. And it is best so. He is no longer fitted for the position.
No one would take him now, even if he got it. He would not be able to do himself credit in it, on account of his deliberateness of speech and lack of trained professional vivacity. He would be put on real estate, and would have the pain of seeing younger and abler men entrusted with the furniture and other such goods which draw a mixed and intellectually low order of customers, who must be beguiled of their bids by vulgar and specialized humor and sparkle, accompanied with antics. But it is not the thing lost that counts, but only the disappointment the loss brings to the dreamer that had coveted that thing, and had set his heart of hearts upon it. And when we remember this, a great wave of sorrow for Howells rises in our breasts, and we wish for his sake that his fate could have been different. At that time Hay's boyhood dream was not yet past hope of realization, but it was fading, dimming, wasting away, and the wind of a growing apprehension was blowing cold over the perishing summer of his life. In the pride of his young ambition he had aspired to be a steamboat mate, and in fancy saw himself dominating a forecastle some day on the Mississippi, and dictating terms to roustabouts in high and wounding terms. I look back now from this far distance of 70 years, and note with sorrow the stages of that dream's destruction. Hay's history is but Howells, with differences of detail. Hay climbed high towards his ideal. When success seemed almost sure, his foot upon the very gangplank, his eye upon the capstan, misfortune came, and his fall began. Down, 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 ever down, private secretary to the President, colonel in the field, chargé d'affaires in Paris, chargé d'affaires in Vienna, poet, editor of the Tribune, biographer of Lincoln, ambassador to England, and now at last there he lies, Secretary of State, head of foreign affairs, and he has fallen, like Lucifer, never to rise again. And his dream, where now is his dream? Gone down in blood and tears with the dream of the auctioneer. And the young dream of Aldrich, where is that? I remember yet how he sat there that night fondling it, petting it, seeing it recede and ever recede, trying to be reconciled and give it up, but not able yet to bear the thought. For it had been his hope to be a horse doctor. He also climbed high, but, like the others, fell. Then fell again, and yet again, and again, and again. And now at last he can fall no farther. He is old now, he has ceased to struggle, and is only a poet. No one would risk a horse with him now. His dream is over. Has any boyhood dream ever been fulfilled? I must doubt it. Look at Brander Matthews. He wanted to be a cowboy. What is he today? Nothing but a professor in a university. Will he ever be a cowboy? It is hardly conceivable. Look at Stockton. What was Stockton's young dream? He hoped to be a barkeep. See where he has landed? Is it better with Cable? What was Cable's young dream? To be ringmaster in the circus, and swell around and crack the whip. What is he today? Nothing but a theologian and novelist. And Uncle Remus, what was his young dream? To be a buccaneer. Look at him now. Ah, the dreams of our youth, how beautiful they are, and how perishable. The ruins of these might-have-beens, how pathetic. The heart-secrets that were revealed that night now so long vanished, how they touch me as I give them voice. Those sweet privacies, how they endeared us to each other. We were under oath never to tell any of these things, and I have always kept that oath inviolate when speaking with persons whom I thought not worthy to hear them. Oh, our lost youth! God keep its memory green in our hearts, for age is upon us with the indignity of its infirmities, and death beckons. End of my boyhood dreams, and end of segment 35 of The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg and Other Stories by Mark Twain. This is To the Above Old People. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg and Other Stories by Mark Twain, Section 36, To the Above Old People. Sleep, for the sun that scores another day against the tale allotted you to stay, reminding you, is risen, and now serves notice. Ah, ignore it while you stay. The chill wind blew, and those who stood before the tavern murmured, "Having drunk his score, why tarries he with empty cup? Behold, the wine of youth, once poured, is poured no more. Come, leave the cup, and on the winter's snow your summer garment of enjoyment throw. Your tide of life is ebbing fast, and it, exhausted once, for you no more shall flow." While yet the phantom of false youth was mine, I heard a voice from out the darkness whine, "O youth, O whither gone? Return, and bathe my age in thy reviving wine." In this subduing draught of tender green and kindly absinthe, with its wimbling sheen of dusky half-lights, let me drown the haunting pathos of the might-have-been. For every nickeled joy, marred and brief, we pay some day its weight in golden grief mined from our hearts. Ah, murmur not from this one-sided bargain dream of no relief. The joy of life, that streaming through their veins tumultuous swept, falls slack, and wanes the glory in the eye, and one by one life's pleasures perish and make place for pains. Whether one hide in some secluded nook, whether at Liverpool or Sandy Hook, 'tis one, old age will search him out, and he, when ready, will know where to look. From cradle unto grave I keep a house of entertainment, where may drowse bacilli and kindred germs, or feed or breed their festering species in a deep carouse. Think, in this battered caravanserai, whose portals open stand on night and day, how microbe after microbe with his pomp arrives unasked and comes to stay. Our ivory teeth, confessing to the lust of masticating once, now own disgust of clay-plugged cavities. Full soon our snags are emptied, and our mouths are filled with dust. Our gums forsake the teeth and tender grow, and fat like overripe figs. We know the sign. The rig's disease is ours, and we must list this sorrow, add another woe. Our lungs begin to fail, and soon we cough, and chilly streaks play up our backs, and off our fevered foreheads drips an icy sweat. We scoffed before, but now we may not scoff. Some for the bunions that afflict us prate of plasters unsurpassable, and hate to cut a corn. Ah, cut, and let the plaster go, nor murmur if the solace come too late. Some for the honors of old age, and some long for its respite from the hum and clash of sordid strife. O fools, the past should teach them what's to come. Lo, for the honors, cold neglect instead. For respite, disputation's heirs a bed of thorns for them will furnish. Go, seek not here for peace, but yonder with the dead. For whether Zal and Rustam heed this sign, and even smitten thus will not repine, let Zal and Rustam shuffle as they may, the fine once levied they must cash the fine. O voices of the long ago that were so dear, fallen silent now for many a mouldering year, O whither are ye flown? Come back and break my heart, but bless my grieving ear. Some happy day my voice will silent fall, and answer not when some that love it call. Be glad for me when this you note, and think I've found the voices lost beyond the pall. So let me grateful drain the magic bowl that medicines hurt minds, and on the soul the healing of its peace doth lay. If then death claim me, welcome be his dole. Sanna, Sweden, September 15th. Private. If you don't know what Rigg's disease of the teeth is, the dentist will tell you. I've had it, and it is more than interesting. M.T. Editorial note. Fearing that there might be some mistake, we submitted a proof of this article to the American gentleman named in it, and asked them to correct any errors of detail that might have crept in among the facts. They reply with some asperity that errors cannot creep in among facts where there are no facts for them to creep in among, and that none are discoverable in this article, but only baseless aberrations of a disordered mind. They have no recollection of any such night in Boston nor elsewhere, and in their opinion there was never any such night. They have met Mr. Twain, but have had the prudence not to entrust any privacies to him, particularly under oath, and they think they now see that this prudence was justified, since he has been untrustworthy enough to even betray privacies which had no existence. Further, they think it a strange thing that Mr. Twain, who was never invited to meddle with anybody's boyhood dreams but his own, has been so gratuitously anxious to see that other people's are placed before the world that he has quite lost his head in his zeal and forgotten to make any mention of his own at all. Provided we insert this explanation, they are willing to let his article pass. Otherwise, they must require its suppression in the interest of truth. P.S. These replies, having left us in some perplexity, and also in some fear lest they distress Mr. Twain if published without his privity, we judged it but fair to submit them to him and give him an opportunity to defend himself. But he does not seem to be troubled, or even aware that he is in a delicate situation. He merely says, "Do not worry about those former young people. They can write good literature, but when it comes to speaking the truth, they have not had my training." Mark Twain. The last sentence seems obscure and liable to an unfortunate construction. It plainly needs refashioning, but we cannot take the responsibility of doing it. Editor. End of To the Above Old People, and end of Section 36 of The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg and Other Stories by Mark Twain. This is In Memoriam, Olivia Susan Clemens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg and Other Stories by Mark Twain, Section 37, In Memoriam, Olivia Susan Clemens. Died August 18, 1896, age 24. In a fair valley, oh, how long ago, where all the broad expanse was clothed in vines, and fruitful fields and meadows starred with flowers, and clear streams wandered at their idle will, and still lakes slept, their burnished surfaces a dream of painted clouds, and soft airs went whispering with odorous breath, and all was peace in that fair vale, shut from the troubled world, a nameless hamlet drowsed. Hard by, apart, a temple stood, and strangers from the outer world passing noted it with tired eyes, and seeing, saw it not, a glimpse of its fair form, an answering momentary thrill. And they passed on, careless and unaware. They could not know the cunning of its make, they could not know the secret shut up in its heart. Only the dwellers of the hamlet knew. They knew that what seemed brass was gold, what marble seemed was ivory. The glories that enriched the milky surfaces, the trailing vines and interwoven flowers, and tropic birds a-wing, clothed all in tinted fires, they knew for what they were, not what they seemed. Encrustings all of gems, not perishable splendors of the brush. They knew the secret spot where one must stand. They knew the surest hour, the proper slant of sun. To gather in, unmarred, undimmed, the vision of the fane in all its fairy grace. A fainting dream against the opal sky. And more than this, they knew that in the temple's inmost place a spirit dwelt, made all of light. For glimpses of it they had caught beyond the curtains when the priests that served the altar came and went. All loved that light and held it dear that had this partial grace. But the adoring priests alone who lived by day and night submerged in its immortal glow knew all its power and depth, and could appraise the loss if it should fade and fail and come no more. All this was long ago, so long ago. The light burned on, and they that worshipped it, and they that caught its flash at intervals and held it dear, contented lived in its secure possession. Ah, how long ago it was! And then, when they were nothing fearing, and God's peace was in the air, and none was prophesying harm, the vast disaster fell. Where stood the temple when the sun went down was vacant desert when it rose again. Ah, yes, 'tis ages since it chanced. So long ago it was, that from the memory of the hamlet folk the light has passed, they scarce believing, now, that once it was, or, if believing, yet not missing it, and reconciled to have it gone. Not so the priests. Oh, not so the stricken ones that served it day and night. Adoring it, abiding in the healing of its peace, they stand yet, where erst they stood speechless in that dim morning long ago, and still they gaze, as then they gazed, and murmur, "It will come again. It knows our pain, it knows, it knows. Ah, surely it will come again." S. L. C. Lake Lucerne, August 18, 1897. The end of In Memoriam, Olivia Susan Clemens, and the end of The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg and Other Stories by Mark Twain. Read by John Greenman.